Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of history's most misunderstood periods, the so-called Dark Ages, when humanity seemed to forget everything it had learned. You're standing in the crumbling marble halls of Rome in 476 CE, watching as the last Western Roman emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, hands over his imperial regalia to a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. The torches flicker against frescoed walls that once witnessed Caesar's triumphs, and you can almost hear the whispers of 1,000 years of accumulated knowledge beginning to fade into silence. The flickering shadows dance across scrolls scattered on cold floors, each one containing secrets that took generations to discover and record. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why your medieval ancestors seem to know less about medicine than ancient Egyptians, or how entire civilizations could simply forget how to build aqueducts and roads that had functioned flawlessly for centuries. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Feel free to tell me where and when you started watching, or maybe share what fascinates you most about this mysterious period when the lights of learning seem to dim across an entire continent. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You feel the weight of centuries pressing down as you witness the Western Roman Empire's final collapse. This isn't just the fall of a government. You're watching the systematic dismantling of the ancient world's greatest knowledge preservation system. For over a millennium, Rome had been history's ultimate collector, gathering wisdom from conquered territories like a cosmic vacuum cleaner with a particular appetite for scrolls and stone tablets. Greek philosophy, Egyptian engineering, Celtic metallurgy, Germanic agricultural techniques, Persian astronomy, and Babylonian mathematics. All of it flowed into Roman archives, libraries, and administrative centres that stretched from Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain to the blazing deserts beyond the Sahara. The empire's bureaucratic machinery had been knowledge incarnate. You walk through abandoned Roman administrative buildings, where filing systems once catalogued everything from tax records to military engineering manuals, from medical treatises to architectural blueprints. These weren't just government offices, they were vast repositories of practical wisdom accumulated over centuries of conquest and assimilation. Every conquered territory contributed its secrets to this growing imperial brain, and Roman engineers, administrators, and scholars had spent generations refining and systematizing this accumulated knowledge into comprehensive reference works that covered everything from crop rotation to siege warfare. You run your fingers along the carved inscriptions on a building's facade, feeling the precision of Roman stonework that encoded mathematical principles directly into architecture. The Romans didn't just collect knowledge, they transformed it, creating systematic approaches to engineering, law, administration, and urban planning that had never existed before. They built upon Greek theoretical foundations with practical applications, merged Egyptian hydraulic engineering with their own innovations, and created educational systems that could train administrators capable of governing territories spanning 3 continents. But now you watch as barbarian kingdoms carve up these intellectual treasures like wolves dividing a carcass. The Visigoths take Spain, the Vandals claim North Africa, the Ostrogoths settle in Italy, the Saxons establish themselves in Britain, and the Franks carve out territories in Gaul. Each group arrives with their own oral traditions and practical skills. The Goths are magnificent metalworkers. The Franks excel at cavalry warfare. The Saxons understand tidal navigation, but they lack the Romans' obsession with written documentation and systematic knowledge preservation. You observe Visigothic warriors using Roman aqueducts without understanding the mathematical principles that made them possible. living in Roman villas while the hypocaust heating systems gradually fail and are never repaired. The barbarian leaders often try to maintain Roman infrastructure, but you watch as complex systems slowly break down without the institutional knowledge necessary for proper maintenance. A cracked pipe in an aqueduct might go unrepaired for months, because the local Gothic administrator doesn't understand water pressure calculations, and the Roman engineer who designed the system died years ago without training a successor. The transformation isn't sudden. It's like watching a massive library slowly burn, one scroll at a time. While everyone argues about whether they should save the philosophy section or the engineering manuals, you witness Germanic chieftains establishing courts in former Roman palaces, surrounded by frescoes depicting mathematical allegories they can't read and philosophical concepts that have become meaningless decoration. The new rulers often respect Roman learning in theory, but they prioritize immediate survival over abstract knowledge. When your kingdom faces Viking raids, rival tribes, or Byzantine reconquest attempts, you need warriors who can swing swords, not scholars who can calculate the circumference of the earth. You follow a Roman senator named Cassiodorus as he desperately tries to preserve classical learning in this changing world. Around 537 CE, you watch him establish the Vivarium monastery in southern Italy, where he hopes to maintain libraries and scriptoriums that can continue copying essential texts. Cassiodorus represents a generation of Roman intellectuals who see the writing on the crumbling wall. If knowledge is going to survive this transition, it needs new guardians who understand both classical learning and the realities of post-Roman politics. But even this far-sighted planning can't prevent the massive intellectual hemorrhaging you're witnessing across the former empire. The economic foundation of knowledge preservation crumbles beneath your feet like poorly maintained Roman concrete. Roman libraries had been supported by imperial taxation systems that could fund professional scribes, translators, and scholars across thousands of miles of territory. These weren't just books on shelves. They were living institutions with paid positions, regular copying schedules, and networks of scholarly correspondence that kept ideas flowing between distant regions. Professional scribes had been specialized workers within the imperial system, trained in multiple languages and expert in preserving delicate papyrus and parchment manuscripts. Now you watch as these support networks dissolve into the chaos of territorial fragmentation. The new barbarian kingdoms operate on smaller scales with simpler economies based on agricultural tribute, cattle wealth, and personal loyalty bonds rather than the complex monetary systems that had funded Roman intellectual infrastructure. Who has time to maintain libraries when you're fighting for basic territorial control against neighbouring kingdoms, dealing with crop failures, or trying to establish legitimacy among populations that remember when life was more predictable under imperial rule? You observe one of history's great ironies unfolding before your eyes. The barbarian leaders often genuinely admire Roman civilization and desperately want to preserve its benefits, but they lack the institutional framework necessary to maintain such complex systems. Theodoric the Great, king of the Ostrogoths, keeps Roman administrators in their positions and tries to maintain classical education programs, but you can see the cracks spreading through the foundation like frost damage in marble. Without the empire's vast network of schools, libraries and scholarly exchanges, knowledge becomes increasingly isolated and fragmented into competing local traditions. The linguistic situation compounds the crisis exponentially. You watch as Latin, once the universal language of education and administration from Scotland to Syria, begins fragmenting into regional dialects that grow more distinct with each passing generation. Classical Latin texts become increasingly difficult for new generations to read fluently, like trying to decipher a foreign language that was once your native tongue. The barbarian kingdoms each bring their own linguistic traditions: Gothic, Frankish, Vandal, Saxon, and while some rulers and nobles learn Latin for diplomatic purposes, the broader population gradually loses access to the classical written tradition that had been Rome's greatest achievement. You witness scholarly debates that seem almost comically irrelevant to the harsh reality surrounding them. Historians still argue whether the barbarian invasions directly caused intellectual decline or simply coincided with broader systemic changes that were already undermining Roman educational institutions from within. Some scholars point out that Roman learning had been declining even before the barbarian kingdoms established themselves, suggesting that economic pressures, administrative overstretch, and the empire's conversion to Christianity had already weakened traditional knowledge preservation systems. You witness the human cost of this transition through individual stories that break your heart. Boethius, perhaps the last great Roman philosopher, writes The Consolation of Philosophy while imprisoned by Theodoric around 524 CE. You sit with him in his cold cell as he tries to reconcile classical learning with Christian thought, creating what will become one of the medieval period's most influential texts. But Boethius represents the end of an era, after his execution for allegedly plotting against Gothic rule. You won't see another philosopher of his intellectual calibre emerge in Western Europe for several centuries. The famous Roman road system, once the empire's information superhighway that allowed ideas to flow as freely as trade goods, begins deteriorating without constant professional maintenance. You travel these once magnificent routes and watch as communication between distant regions becomes increasingly difficult and dangerous. Knowledge that once flowed freely along Roman roads now becomes trapped in isolated pockets, like water collecting in stagnant pools after a great river changes course. A medical technique perfected in Spain might be completely unknown in Britain, even though both regions had been part of the same educational and administrative system just decades earlier. You end this section standing in the ruins of the Great Library of Trajan in Rome, where precious scrolls lie scattered among fallen columns and broken marble statues. Rain drips through holes in the roof onto texts that chronicled centuries of human discovery and innovation. The barbarian kingdoms will eventually develop their own rich cultures and learning traditions. The Carolingian Renaissance is still centuries in the future, but it will come. For now, though, you're witnessing one of history's great forgettings, the moment when the ancient world's accumulated wisdom slipped through humanity's fingers like water through a broken vessel, leaving future generations to slowly piece together fragments of what their ancestors had once known with casual certainty. The acrid smoke burns your eyes as you watch the great library of Alexandria's final destruction around 391 CE. Though the legendary institution had been dying a slow death for centuries before this moment. You stand among the towering shelves that once held nearly 500,000 scrolls, works of Aristotle, Euclid, Archimedes, and countless other brilliant minds whose names have already begun fading from human memory. The flames consume papyrus and parchment with hungry efficiency, each crackling sound representing years of painstaking research and discovery turning to ash. This isn't just one library burning. You're witnessing the systematic destruction of knowledge repositories across the former Roman world, as libraries transform from centres of learning into convenient sources of fuel for cooking fires and kindling for winter warmth. You feel the heat radiating from burning scrolls as Christian zealots, following Bishop Theophilus's orders, systematically dismantle what they consider a pagan temple to dangerous knowledge. The irony cuts through the smoke-filled air like a blade. Many of these same texts will be desperately sought by Christian scholars centuries later. But right now you watch as mathematical treatises and medical texts burn alongside what the destroyers perceive as threatening philosophical works. A scroll containing Aristarchus's calculations proving the Earth orbits the Sun curls into flame just inches from your face, taking with it knowledge that won't be rediscovered for over 1,000 years. But Alexandria represents just the most famous casualty in a broader catastrophe unfolding across the Mediterranean world. You travel to Constantinople and witness the Imperial Library's gradual decline as successive emperors prioritize military spending over maintaining scholarly collections. The library that once boasted 120,000 volumes slowly contracts as manuscripts are sold, stolen, or simply neglected until they crumble from age and neglect. You run your fingers along empty shelves where Livy's complete works once stood, 142 volumes of Roman history that will survive only in fragments, leaving massive gaps in humanity's understanding of its own past. Do you remember the sophisticated Roman educational system we witnessed collapsing in the previous section? Now you see the physical repositories of that knowledge meeting their end. You visit the libraries of Pergamon, where parchment was invented, and watch as Germanic tribes use the reading rooms as stables for their horses. The scholarly atmosphere that once fostered intellectual debate has been replaced by the practical concerns of housing livestock and storing grain. It's almost amusing in its tragic irony. The very material that preserved knowledge for centuries now serves as bedding for animals whose owners can't read the wisdom it contains. The process isn't always violent or dramatic. In many cases, you observe a more subtle form of destruction through simple neglect and changed priorities. You follow a monk through the remnants of a Roman villa's private library, watching him carefully select which texts deserve copying and which can be discarded as irrelevant to Christian learning. Plato's Republic might survive, but Pliny's natural history, with its detailed observations about the physical world, gets tossed aside as insufficiently spiritual. The monk isn't being malicious. He's making practical decisions about how to use limited parchment and copying time. But you're watching centuries of empirical knowledge disappear with each rejected manuscript. You witness the economic factors that make knowledge preservation nearly impossible. Parchment costs a fortune. A single book might require the skins of an entire flock of sheep or goats. In a world where people struggle to feed their families, spending months copying astronomical treatises seems like an inexcusable luxury. You watch scribes reuse precious parchment by scraping off existing text to write new material, creating palimpsests that preserve fragments of lost works beneath layers of later writing. Archimedes' mathematical treatises survive only because medieval scribes wrote prayer books over them, inadvertently preserving genius beneath devotional texts. The destruction extends beyond libraries to entire educational networks. You visit the schools of Athens, where Plato's academy had operated for nearly 900 years until Emperor Justinian closed it in 529 CE. The last philosophers pack their remaining books and flee to Persia, taking with them oral traditions and teaching methods that had been refined over centuries. You see them arrive at the court of Khosrow I, where Persian scholars welcome Greek learning that's being systematically expelled from the Christian Byzantine Empire. You observe the linguistic barriers that accelerate knowledge loss. As Latin fragments into regional dialects and local languages gain prominence, fewer people can read the classical texts even when they survive physical destruction. You watch a Frankish noble examining a Roman engineering manual, recognizing the diagrams of aqueduct construction but unable to comprehend the accompanying mathematical explanations written in classical Latin. The knowledge is physically present but intellectually inaccessible, like having a key to a door whose lock has been changed. The barbarian kingdoms often respect learning in theory, but lack the infrastructure to maintain scholarly traditions. You visit Theodoric's court in Ravenna, where the Gothic king surrounds himself with Roman advisors and claims to value classical education. But you notice that while Theodoric can sign his name, he struggles to read lengthy documents, and his court's priorities focus on immediate political and military challenges rather than long-term knowledge preservation. The gap between intention and capability grows wider with each passing generation. You witness one of history's strangest ironies unfolding as Islamic scholars in Baghdad and Damascus begin collecting and translating the very Greek texts that Christian Europe is systematically destroying or neglecting. While you watch European libraries burn, Arab and Persian translators are carefully preserving Aristotle, Ptolemy, and Galen in Arabic translations that will keep these ideas alive for centuries. The knowledge isn't disappearing entirely, it's migrating eastward, like migratory birds seeking more hospitable climates. Historians still argue whether the library destructions were primarily driven by religious zealotry, economic necessity, or simple cultural indifference to written learning. Some scholars emphasize deliberate Christian persecution of pagan knowledge, while others point to broader social changes that made written culture less relevant to predominantly oral societies. The truth probably combines all these factors. Religious hostility provided justification for destructions that economic pressures and cultural shifts had already made inevitable. You experience the psychological impact of watching accumulated knowledge vanish. Individual scholars like Isidore of Seville desperately try to preserve essential information by creating encyclopedic summaries, but you see how much gets lost in these condensations. His Etymologies becomes a crucial reference work for medieval scholars, but comparing it to the original sources he used reveals how much nuance and detail disappears in the process of compression. It's like trying to preserve an entire symphony by humming the main melody. Something survives, but the richness and complexity are irretrievably lost. The destruction creates cascading effects that compound over time. When technical manuals disappear, craftsmen lose the theoretical knowledge that had elevated their practical skills. You watch Roman cement recipes vanish, along with the treatises that explain the chemical principles behind hydraulic construction. Future generations will build with inferior materials not because they lack skill or intelligence, but because the accumulated knowledge base that supported advanced techniques has been systematically destroyed. You witness the emergence of what scholars call technological regression, the phenomenon where societies become incapable of reproducing their ancestors' achievements. Roman engineers had built the Pantheon with its massive concrete dome, but by 600 CE, you watch European builders struggling to construct simple arched bridges because the mathematical knowledge and engineering principles have been lost along with the texts that preserved them. The loss extends to medical knowledge with tragic consequences. You observe Alexandrian medical texts burning while plague and disease ravage populations that no longer have access to treatments their ancestors had perfected. Greek physicians had developed sophisticated surgical techniques and pharmaceutical preparations, but this knowledge evaporates along with the libraries that housed medical treatises. Future generations will treat illnesses with folk remedies and prayer because the scientific medical tradition has been severed. You end this section standing in a scriptorium where a monk carefully copies the Bible while using pages from a mathematical treatise as scratch paper for his calculations. The irony is heartbreaking. Knowledge that took generations to develop becomes literally disposable, valued only for the parchment it's written on rather than the wisdom it contains. The great libraries have become ash and memory, their contents scattered to the winds like seeds that may or may not find fertile ground in the centuries ahead. You hear the rhythmic scratch of quill on parchment echoing through stone corridors as you enter the monastery of Monte Cassino around 529 CE, where St. Benedict has just established what will become the most influential monastic rule in Christian history. The irony strikes you immediately. While libraries burn across Europe and classical learning faces systematic destruction, these Christian monks are becoming the unlikely guardians of the very pagan knowledge their religious authorities often condemn. You watch Brother Marcus carefully copying Virgil's Aeneid in the scriptorium, his weathered hands preserving epic poetry that celebrates Roman gods and heroes, even as he dedicates his life to Christian service. The transformation of monasteries from simple religious retreats into intellectual fortresses happens gradually, driven by practical necessity rather than grand design. You observe how Cassiodorus, the former Roman senator we met earlier, influences this evolution by bringing his vast personal library to the Vivarium monastery he establishes in southern Italy. Unlike other religious leaders who view classical learning with suspicion, Cassiodorus argues that monks need to understand grammar, rhetoric, and philosophy to properly interpret scripture and defend Christian doctrine against sophisticated pagan arguments. You follow the daily routine in these early monastic scriptoriums, watching monks balance religious devotion with intellectual preservation. The rule of St. Benedict prescribes specific hours for manual labour, prayer, and study, creating structured environments where copying manuscripts becomes a form of worship. Brother Augustine spends 6 hours each day hunched over a writing desk, meticulously reproducing Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, while Brother Jerome works on mathematical treatises by Euclid. The scratching of their pens creates a gentle symphony of preservation that drowns out the distant sounds of warfare and social collapse happening beyond the monastery walls. The monks face enormous challenges in their role as knowledge guardians. Parchment remains fantastically expensive. You watch the monastery's abbot carefully allocate precious writing materials, knowing that choosing to copy one text means another might be lost forever. The decision-making process reveals the complex priorities these religious communities must navigate. Do you preserve Aristotle's logical works because they help in theological debates? Or focus on medical treatises that could save lives during plague outbreaks? Each choice carries the weight of potentially permanent consequences for human knowledge. You witness the development of distinctive monastic copying practices that will preserve texts for centuries. The monks create detailed rules for scribes, how to prepare parchment, mix ink, maintain consistent letter spacing, and create illuminated decorations that protect important passages. You watch Brother Thomas develop a correction system using dots and symbols to mark copying errors, creating quality control measures that ensure accuracy across multiple generations of manuscript reproduction. These seemingly minor innovations become crucial for maintaining textual integrity as knowledge passes through centuries of hand copying. The monasteries gradually evolve into more than just copying centres. They become active centres of learning where classical knowledge merges with Christian theology. You observe scholarly debates in the monastery's library where monks discuss Platonic philosophy's compatibility with Christian doctrine, or argue about whether Aristotelian logic can be used to prove religious truths. These intellectual exchanges keep classical ideas alive and evolving rather than simply preserving them as museum pieces. Do you remember the linguistic fragmentation we witnessed destroying Roman educational networks? The monasteries provide crucial stability in this chaotic environment. Latin remains the language of monastic scholarship, creating bridges between regions where local populations can no longer communicate effectively. You travel with a monk carrying manuscripts from Ireland to Italy, watching him engage in scholarly conversations with the religious communities across linguistic boundaries that have become insurmountable for secular populations. You witness the emergence of monastic schools that begin accepting students from outside religious communities. The monastery at Tours, under Alcuin's leadership, attracts young nobles and future administrators who receive educations combining classical learning with Christian instruction. These schools become islands of literacy in societies where reading and writing skills are rapidly disappearing among secular populations. You watch teenage students struggling with Latin grammar while copying texts that preserve mathematical and scientific knowledge their ancestors had taken for granted. The monks develop innovative approaches to organizing and preserving knowledge that anticipate modern library systems. You observe the creation of detailed catalogues listing every manuscript in monastic collections, with descriptions of contents and copying dates that help scholars locate specific information. The monastery at St. Gall creates a systematic classification system that groups texts by subject matter, making classical knowledge more accessible to future researchers. These organizational innovations represent genuine intellectual achievements that emerge from practical necessity. You experience the tension between religious orthodoxy and intellectual curiosity that constantly challenges monastic communities. Brother William secretly copies works by pagan philosophers while publicly denouncing their errors, creating hidden collections of controversial texts that preserve dangerous ideas for future generations. The monastery's abbot must balance his community's spiritual mission against their role as knowledge preservers, sometimes making difficult decisions about which classical works deserve preservation despite their potentially heretical content. The physical security that monasteries provide becomes increasingly important as political instability spreads across Europe. You watch monks hurriedly hiding manuscripts during Viking raids, creating secret chambers and buried caches that protect precious texts from destruction. The monastery's thick walls and remote locations offer protection that secular libraries cannot provide, making religious communities the only institutions capable of maintaining long-term scholarly projects in an increasingly violent world. Historians still argue whether monastic preservation efforts were primarily motivated by genuine intellectual curiosity or simply practical necessity for theological education. Some scholars emphasize monks' authentic appreciation for classical learning, while others suggest that religious communities preserved pagan texts only because they needed grammatical and rhetorical models for Christian writing. The reality probably includes both motivations. Practical utility provided justification for preserving knowledge that many monks genuinely found fascinating. You observe how monastic communities adapt classical knowledge to serve Christian purposes, creating hybrid intellectual traditions that transform ancient learning rather than simply preserving it unchanged. Monks use Aristotelian logic to develop sophisticated theological arguments, apply Roman administrative principles to monastery management, and merge Greek mathematical concepts with Christian symbolic interpretations. This adaptive preservation ensures knowledge survival, but also changes its fundamental character. The monastery's role as training centres for future administrators gives their educational efforts political significance that extends far beyond religious boundaries. You watch young men who will become bishops, royal advisors, and territorial governors receiving educations that combine practical skills with classical learning. These students carry monastic intellectual traditions into secular positions, creating networks that spread classical knowledge throughout emerging medieval institutions. You witness the beginning of what scholars call the Carolingian Renaissance, still centuries in the future but rooted in monastic preservation efforts you're observing now. The scriptoriums at Corbière, Saint Martin of Tours, and Saint Denis are creating manuscript collections that will provide source materials for the intellectual revival Charlemagne will promote in the late 8th century. Without these patient copying efforts, the classical texts that inspire future European renaissances would have vanished entirely. The monastic preservation movement creates unexpected cultural exchanges that enrich European intellectual life. You observe Irish monks travelling to continental monasteries, bringing Celtic learning traditions that merge with Roman and Greek knowledge preserved in Italian scriptoriums. These cross-cultural fertilizations produce innovative synthetic works that combine different intellectual traditions in ways that wouldn't have been possible during the Roman Empire's more rigid cultural hierarchies. You experience the profound satisfaction that drives monastic scribes to continue their painstaking work despite external chaos and uncertainty. Brother Francis explains that copying classical texts connects him to centuries of human wisdom, while serving God through preservation of knowledge that demonstrates divine intelligence in creation. This spiritual motivation sustains copying projects that might otherwise seem pointless, given the apparent collapse of classical civilization. The monasteries develop specialized roles within broader preservation networks, with different communities focusing on particular types of knowledge. You visit scriptoriums that specialize in medical texts, mathematical treatises, or philosophical works, creating distributed library systems that reduce risks of total knowledge loss. This specialization allows monastic communities to develop genuine expertise in specific fields while maintaining connections with other preservation centers. You end this section in the candlelit scriptorium at Monte Cassino, watching monks work late into the night copying manuscripts that will bridge the gap between classical antiquity and medieval Renaissance. Their quiet dedication transforms these religious communities into intellectual time capsules, preserving human knowledge through centuries of darkness until conditions become favourable for renewed learning. The scratching of their pens continues steadily, writing tomorrow's possibilities onto today's parchment with patient, faithful hands. You stand in a village market in 7th century Gaul, listening to a conversation between two merchants that would have been impossible just 2 centuries earlier. One speaks what will eventually become French, the other Proto-Italian, and neither can understand the other without gesturing wildly and drawing pictures in the dirt. The Latin that once unified the entire Western world has fractured into dozens of regional dialects, each evolving separately like islands of meaning drifting apart in an ocean of linguistic confusion. You're witnessing one of history's most devastating barriers to knowledge preservation, the moment when a common intellectual language dissolves into mutually incomprehensible local tongues. The transformation happens gradually, like watching a river split into multiple streams that eventually flow in completely different directions. You follow a Roman administrative document from 500 CE as it travels through various territories over the next 2 centuries, observing how each region's scribes add their own linguistic peculiarities when copying the text. By 700 CE, what began as standard classical Latin has become so corrupted with local vocabulary, simplified grammar, and regional pronunciation patterns that scholars in different kingdoms can barely recognize it as the same language. Do you remember the monastic scriptoriums we visited, where monks preserved classical texts through careful copying? Now you watch those same dedicated scribes unconsciously introducing linguistic changes that make their copies increasingly difficult for future scholars to understand. Brother Paul at a monastery in northern France copies Virgil's poetry with perfect devotion, but his version includes Frankish vocabulary and simplified verb forms that reflect how Latin is actually spoken in his region. He's not trying to change the text, he's simply writing in the only version of Latin he knows. The consequences compound exponentially as each generation moves further from classical linguistic standards. You observe young monks struggling to understand texts copied by their predecessors just 50 years earlier, like trying to read a foreign language that was once your mother tongue. The monastery's library contains multiple versions of the same work, each slightly different due to linguistic drift, creating confusion about which version preserves the original meaning. Knowledge isn't just being lost, it's being transformed in ways that make recovery increasingly difficult. You witness the emergence of what linguists call medieval Latin, a hybrid language that combines classical grammar with contemporary vocabulary and regional pronunciation patterns. This isn't necessarily inferior to classical Latin, it's often more expressive and flexible, but it creates communication barriers that divide the intellectual community into isolated pockets. A scholar in Spain might write brilliant theological commentary that remains completely inaccessible to equally brilliant thinkers in Germany, because their versions of Latin have evolved in different directions. The barbarian kingdoms accelerate linguistic fragmentation by introducing their own languages as competing systems of communication. You attend court sessions where Gothic nobles conduct business in their native tongue while relying on translators to communicate with Roman administrators who speak corrupted Latin mixed with local dialects. Important legal concepts and administrative procedures get lost in translation, creating gaps in knowledge transmission that affect everything from property law to military organization. You experience the frustration of scholars attempting to study classical texts without adequate linguistic preparation. A young monk named Thomas spends months trying to understand Aristotle's logical treatises, not because the philosophical concepts are too complex, but because the classical Greek terminology has no equivalent in his simplified medieval Latin vocabulary. Technical terms that had precise meanings in ancient philosophical discourse become vague generalities that obscure rather than clarify important distinctions. The situation becomes almost comically tragic when you observe translation chains that pass knowledge through multiple languages, each step introducing new errors and misunderstandings. You follow Aristotle's politics as it travels from original Greek to Arabic, then from Arabic to Hebrew, then from Hebrew to Latin, with each translation introducing cultural assumptions and linguistic limitations that distort the original meaning. By the time European scholars finally encounter this text, it bears only distant resemblance to what Aristotle actually wrote. You witness the development of regional scholarly communities that become intellectually isolated due to linguistic barriers. Irish monasteries develop sophisticated learning traditions that remain completely unknown to Italian scholars, not because of physical distance or political hostility, but simply because their versions of Latin have diverged so dramatically that written communication becomes impossible. Knowledge that should flow freely between scholarly communities gets trapped in linguistic silos that prevent beneficial exchange. The fragmentation affects different types of knowledge unequally, creating bizarre patterns of preservation and loss. You observe how poetic works often survive better than prose because their rhythmic patterns help preserve original language forms, while technical treatises become incomprehensible as specialized vocabulary evolves in different directions. Mathematical knowledge suffers particularly severe damage because precision of terminology is crucial for understanding complex concepts, and even small linguistic changes can make calculations completely meaningless. Historians still argue whether linguistic fragmentation was an inevitable result of political decentralization or whether deliberate policies could have maintained classical Latin as a scholarly lingua franca. Some scholars point to the success of Arabic in maintaining intellectual unity across the Islamic world, while others argue that Latin's survival in any form represents a remarkable achievement given the social chaos of post-Roman Europe. You discover unexpected benefits hidden within this linguistic catastrophe. Regional languages often preserve local knowledge that classical Latin couldn't adequately express. Celtic agricultural techniques, Germanic metallurgy, Frankish military tactics, creating hybrid scholarly traditions that combine classical learning with indigenous wisdom. The Abbey of St. Gall produces manuscripts that merge Roman administrative methods with Germanic legal concepts, creating new approaches to governance that neither tradition could have developed independently. The barbarian languages contribute specialized vocabularies that enrich intellectual discourse in unexpected ways. You observe how Germanic words for craftsmanship and metalworking provide more precise terminology than classical Latin equivalents, allowing technical treatises to describe complex processes with greater accuracy. Arabic mathematical terms introduced through translations offer conceptual tools that Latin entirely lacked, enabling European scholars to engage with mathematical ideas that would have been literally unthinkable in classical terminology. You watch the emergence of translation schools that attempt to bridge linguistic gaps through systematic scholarly effort. The School of Translators in Toledo, still centuries in the future, will represent the culmination of efforts you're observing now as bilingual scholars develop techniques for transferring knowledge between Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin intellectual traditions. These translation projects will eventually recover much classical knowledge, but only after centuries of separation have created significant gaps in European learning. The linguistic barriers create social hierarchies that further restrict knowledge access. You observe how classical Latin becomes a mark of elite education, while regional dialects are associated with lower social classes. This linguistic stratification means that knowledge preservation becomes concentrated among small groups of educated clergy and nobility, reducing the broader population's access to classical learning even when texts physically survive. You witness the psychological impact of linguistic alienation on individual scholars who recognize their growing separation from classical tradition. An elderly monk named Augustine sadly explains that he can no longer understand the Latin poetry he copied as a young man, not because his memory has failed, but because his understanding of Latin itself has changed so dramatically. The language that once connected him to centuries of human wisdom now feels like a foreign code that requires constant interpretation. The fragmentation extends beyond vocabulary and grammar to fundamental concepts of knowledge organization. You observe how different regions develop incompatible systems for categorizing information, creating intellectual frameworks that make scholarly communication increasingly difficult. What Italian monks classify as natural philosophy might be completely different from how Irish scholars organize the same knowledge, making collaborative research virtually impossible. You experience the irony of watching classical knowledge become more accessible to non-Latin speakers while becoming less accessible to Latin speakers themselves. Arabic and Hebrew translations often preserve Greek philosophical concepts more accurately than contemporary Latin versions because the translators work directly from original sources, while European scribes copied corrupted texts that had passed through multiple linguistic transformations. The linguistic chaos creates opportunities for intellectual innovation as scholars develop new approaches to knowledge preservation and transmission. You watch the development of glosses, commentaries, and explanatory notes that attempt to bridge linguistic gaps, creating hybrid texts that combine original classical sources with contemporary interpretations. These scholarly innovations will eventually contribute to new forms of academic writing that blend multiple intellectual traditions. You end this section listening to a scholarly debate conducted in 4 different languages, with participants switching between Latin, Arabic, Greek, and local vernacular depending on which terminology best expresses their ideas. The linguistic barriers haven't prevented intellectual exchange. They've transformed it into a complex multilingual dance where knowledge flows through translation, adaptation, and creative misunderstanding. The unity of classical Latin is gone forever, but from its fragments, new forms of scholarly communication are slowly emerging. You step into the House of Wisdom in Baghdad around 830 CE, and the contrast with European intellectual centres is so dramatic it takes your breath away. While Europe stumbles through linguistic confusion and knowledge fragmentation, you're surrounded by the largest library in the world, over 400,000 manuscripts in Arabic, Persian, Greek, Sanskrit, and Hebrew, all carefully catalogued and actively studied by scholars from across 3 continents. The air hums with intellectual energy as translators work systematically through Greek philosophical texts. Mathematicians develop algebraic notation that will revolutionize human calculation, and astronomers build instruments that map the heavens with unprecedented precision. The Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun has just declared that knowledge belongs to all humanity, regardless of its religious or cultural origins, creating an intellectual atmosphere that would be impossible in contemporary Christian Europe. You watch Muslim scholars poring over Aristotle's complete works, texts that European monasteries have lost or deliberately destroyed, while Christian and Jewish scholars work alongside them as respected colleagues rather than barely tolerated minorities. It's like stepping from a dimly lit room into brilliant sunlight. discovering intellectual possibilities you'd forgotten could exist. The translation movement represents perhaps history's greatest systematic preservation effort, dwarfing even the Roman Empire's knowledge collection activities. You observe teams of translators working with methodical precision to transfer Greek scientific and philosophical works into Arabic, creating not just copies, but improved versions that correct errors accumulated through centuries of manuscript transmission. A Persian scholar named Hunayn ibn Ishaq has developed translation techniques so sophisticated that his Arabic versions of Galen's medical treatises are more accurate than the corrupted Greek manuscripts surviving in Byzantine libraries. Do you remember the barbarian kingdoms we saw struggling to maintain Roman engineering knowledge? Here in Baghdad, you watch scholars not just preserving ancient wisdom but actively improving upon it. Al-Khwarizmi takes Hindu mathematical concepts, combines them with Greek geometric principles, and creates algebra, a revolutionary mathematical tool that provides systematic methods for solving equations that had baffled mathematicians for centuries. His work represents genuine intellectual advancement, not just preservation of existing knowledge. You witness the emergence of experimental science as Islamic scholars move beyond simply copying ancient texts to testing and verifying classical claims through direct observation. In a laboratory attached to the House of Wisdom, you watch Al-Kindi conduct experiments with optics that challenge Ptolemy's theories about vision, using carefully designed apparatus to demonstrate how light behaves in ways that contradict ancient Greek assumptions. This represents a fundamental shift from accepting ancient authority to demanding empirical verification that will eventually transform human understanding of the natural world. The scale of intellectual activity overwhelms you as you explore Baghdad's scholarly institutions. The city contains dozens of libraries, each specializing in particular fields, medical colleges with complete collections of Greek and Indian medical texts, astronomical observatories equipped with instruments that surpass anything available in ancient Alexandria, translation academies where scholars fluent in multiple languages work to make knowledge accessible across cultural boundaries. It's like discovering a parallel universe where learning continued to flourish while European civilization stumbled through darkness. You observe the sophisticated patronage system that makes this intellectual flowering possible. Wealthy merchants, government officials, and religious leaders compete to fund translation projects, library construction, and scholarly research, creating economic incentives for knowledge preservation that Europe completely lacks. The Banu Musa brothers receive enormous royal stipends to translate mechanical treatises and design automated devices, while physicians like Al-Razi earn fortunes by developing new medical treatments based on systematic observation of diseases. The social integration of scholarly activity amazes you as you watch how Islamic civilization treats knowledge as a valuable commodity worthy of serious investment. You visit markets where book dealers sell mathematical treatises alongside spices and silks. Observe mosque schools where children learn Greek geometry as part of basic education, and attend court sessions where legal decisions reference philosophical principles preserved from ancient Athens. Knowledge isn't isolated in monasteries. It permeates every aspect of social and economic life. You experience the intellectual excitement generated by cross-cultural fertilization as scholars from different traditions collaborate on unprecedented projects. A Jewish mathematician works with a Persian astronomer and an Arab translator to create improved star charts that combine Ptolemaic Greek astronomy with Hindu numerical systems and original Islamic observations. These collaborative efforts produce innovations that no single cultural tradition could have achieved independently, demonstrating how knowledge preservation becomes a catalyst for genuine advancement. The medical schools particularly impress you with their systematic approach to preserving and improving ancient wisdom. You watch students at the Bimaristan Hospital in Baghdad studying complete translations of Hippocrates, Galen, and Indian medical texts while simultaneously conducting clinical observations that test classical theories against contemporary patient outcomes. Their teachers encourage questioning ancient authorities when experience suggests different treatments might be more effective, creating an intellectual atmosphere that balances respect for tradition with openness to innovation. Historians still argue whether the Islamic Golden Age represents genuine intellectual advancement or simply superior preservation of existing knowledge. But you're witnessing clear evidence of original thinking that extends far beyond mere copying. Al-Jabir's chemical experiments go well beyond anything attempted by ancient Greek or Roman investigators, while al-Battani's astronomical observations correct errors in Ptolemy's calculations that had persisted for nearly 7 centuries. You observe how the Arabic language itself contributes to intellectual advancement by providing more flexible vocabulary for expressing complex ideas than the corrupted Latin used in European monasteries. Arabic mathematical terminology allows precise discussion of concepts that Latin simply cannot adequately express, while Arabic philosophical vocabulary enables subtle distinctions that help clarify arguments that remain confused in contemporary European translations. The language becomes a tool for intellectual precision rather than a barrier to understanding. The global scope of Islamic scholarship creates knowledge networks that span from Spain to Central Asia, maintaining intellectual connections across distances that would have challenged even the Roman Empire at its height. You read correspondence between scholars in Cordoba and Samarkand, discussing mathematical problems, observe students travelling from Cairo to Baghdad to study with particular teachers, and witness book copying projects that distribute identical texts across thousands of miles of territory. You discover unexpected connections between Islamic scholarship and European knowledge preservation, as you watch Christian scholars secretly travelling to Islamic libraries to copy texts that no longer exist in European monasteries. These intellectual refugees return to European scriptoriums with Arabic translations of Greek works that had been lost in the West for centuries, creating underground networks that slowly reintroduce classical learning to regions that had forgotten their own intellectual heritage. The specialization of Islamic scholarship impresses you with its systematic organization of knowledge into distinct disciplines with professional standards and methodological approaches. You visit schools dedicated entirely to mathematics, others focused on medicine, and still others that concentrate on philosophical translation and commentary. This intellectual division of labour allows scholars to develop genuine expertise while maintaining connections with broader scholarly networks through shared libraries and scholarly correspondence. You witness the development of new intellectual tools that will eventually transform European scholarship when they're finally transmitted westward. Arabic numerals and algebraic notation provide mathematical capabilities that Roman numerals simply cannot match, while Arabic grammatical analysis creates linguistic techniques that will revolutionize European approaches to textual interpretation and translation. The economic prosperity that supports Islamic scholarship creates positive feedback loops that accelerate intellectual development. You observe how mathematical advances enable more sophisticated commercial techniques, which generate wealth that funds further scholarly research, which produces technological innovations that increase economic productivity. Knowledge becomes economically valuable rather than merely prestigious, creating sustainable incentives for continued intellectual investment. You experience the tolerance and intellectual curiosity that characterize Islamic Golden Age scholarship as you watch Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and Zoroastrian scholars engage in respectful debates about fundamental questions of philosophy, science, and mathematics. Religious differences don't prevent scholarly collaboration, they provide different perspectives that enrich intellectual discourse and lead to more sophisticated understanding of complex problems. The contrast with contemporary European intellectual life becomes almost painful as you remember the linguistic barriers, resource constraints, and intellectual isolation that characterized post-Roman scholarship in the West. While European monks struggle to copy corrupted Latin texts in poorly equipped scriptoriums, Islamic scholars work in well-funded institutions with access to knowledge from across the known world, sophisticated instruments for scientific research, and social systems that reward intellectual achievement. You end this section in the House of Wisdom's main reading room, watching scholars from a dozen different cultures and 3 different continents working together to unlock the secrets of mathematics, medicine, philosophy, and astronomy. The knowledge that Europe has forgotten lives and breathes here, not as museum pieces but as living tools for understanding and improving the world. The Islamic Golden Age isn't just preserving classical learning, it's using that foundation to build intellectual achievements that surpass anything the ancient world accomplished. You hear the terrifying war cries echoing across the North Sea as dragon-prowed longships slice through morning mist toward the monastery at Lindisfarne in 793 CE. The Viking raids that will terrorize Europe for the next 3 centuries are about to begin, and you're witnessing the start of perhaps the most devastating assault on knowledge preservation since the barbarian invasions dismantled Roman libraries. The monastery's bells ring frantically as monks spot the approaching vessels, but there's no time to hide their precious manuscripts before Norse warriors storm ashore with axes gleaming and torches ready to burn everything that represents the Christian civilization they've come to plunder. The attack on Lindisfarne shocks the scholarly world because this monastery had been considered absolutely safe from worldly violence. You watch in horror as Viking raiders systematically destroy one of Europe's most important scriptoriums, burning manuscripts that took generations to copy and scattering parchment leaves like autumn debris across blood-stained floors. The illuminated Lindisfarne Gospels barely survive because a quick-thinking monk stuffs them into a leather satchel and flees into the surrounding marshes. But countless other irreplaceable texts feed the flames that consume centuries of patient scholarly work in a single morning of violence. The psychological impact devastates European intellectual communities more than the physical destruction alone. You travel to monasteries across Britain and Ireland, watching monks abandon their scriptoriums and flee inland, carrying what manuscripts they can save but leaving behind libraries that represented the accumulated learning of their communities. The very institutions that had served as Europe's intellectual lifelines now become obvious targets for raiders who recognize that monasteries combine valuable treasures with minimal military defenses. Do you remember the painstaking preservation efforts we witnessed in monastic scriptoriums? Now you watch those same communities scatter like startled birds, interrupting copying projects that had been in progress for decades. At the monastery of Iona, you observe monks hurriedly burying manuscripts in sealed containers, hoping to preserve their scholarly treasures until the Viking threat passes. Some of these buried libraries will remain hidden for centuries, their contents lost not to deliberate destruction, but to the chaos that makes systematic preservation impossible. The Vikings aren't simply mindless destroyers. Their raids follow strategic patterns that target the most vulnerable and valuable centres of learning. You sail with a raiding party as they systematically attack coastal monasteries from Scotland to the Loire Valley, observing how they've learned to identify scriptoriums by their tall towers and isolated locations. The raiders understand that these religious communities contain not just gold and silver ornaments, but portable wealth in the form of illuminated manuscripts that can be sold to Byzantine merchants who value classical texts regardless of how they were acquired. You witness the tragic irony that some of Europe's most beautiful manuscripts survive only because Viking raiders recognize their commercial value. A magnificently illuminated copy of Augustine's City of God becomes a commodity in Mediterranean slave markets, eventually purchased by a wealthy merchant in Constantinople who appreciates its artistic value without understanding its intellectual significance. Knowledge preservation becomes an accidental byproduct of cultural piracy, creating bizarre networks where scholarship survives through criminal enterprises. The raids disrupt the educational networks that had begun connecting European scholarly communities across political boundaries. You watch as the school at York, that had attracted students from across Northern Europe, closes permanently after repeated Viking attacks make travel too dangerous for scholars. The intellectual exchanges that had slowly been rebuilding European learning networks collapse as monasteries focus on physical survival rather than scholarly collaboration. You observe how the constant threat of raids forces fundamental changes in how knowledge is preserved and transmitted. Monasteries that once maintained permanent scriptoriums now operate mobile copying operations that can be quickly packed and moved when raiders approach. You follow a group of Irish monks as they develop portable writing kits and abbreviated copying techniques that sacrifice beautiful illumination for speed and mobility, creating manuscript traditions that prioritize survival over artistic achievement. The disruption accelerates the decentralization of European learning as communities that once shared resources and expertise become isolated and self-protective. You visit the monastery at Saint Martin of Tours, where monks have stopped lending manuscripts to other institutions because too many borrowed texts have been lost in Viking raids. The intellectual networks that had slowly been developing across post-Roman Europe fragment into suspicious, hoarding communities that view sharing knowledge as an unacceptable security risk. Historians still argue whether Viking raids represented primarily economic opportunism or cultural hostility toward Christian learning. But you witness clear evidence that the raiders understood they were attacking the intellectual infrastructure of European civilization. Norse warriors specifically target scriptoriums and libraries within monastic complexes, suggesting they recognize these facilities' importance, even if they don't share European respect for written learning. You experience the desperate measures that scholarly communities adopt to protect their intellectual treasures from systematic destruction. The monks at Kells develop elaborate hiding systems with concealed chambers and false walls designed to protect their most valuable manuscripts during raids. You help them practice emergency procedures where entire libraries can be concealed within minutes of spotting hostile ships on the horizon, creating scholarly versions of military defensive strategies. The psychological warfare aspect of Viking raids proves as devastating as their physical destruction. You observe how the mere threat of attack paralyzes scholarly activity across vast regions, as communities abandon long-term intellectual projects to focus on immediate survival concerns. Copying projects that required years of sustained effort become impossible when scribes never know whether they'll have to flee at a moment's notice, carrying only what manuscripts they can grab during panicked evacuations. You witness the emergence of what scholars call fortress monasteries, as religious communities adapt their architecture and social organization to survive in an increasingly violent environment. The monastery at Glendalough transforms from an open, scholarly community into a fortified compound with watchtowers, thick walls, and emergency escape routes that allow monks to preserve both their lives and their manuscripts when raiders attack. These architectural changes reflect broader shifts from scholarly optimism toward defensive pessimism that will characterize European intellectual life for centuries. The Viking raids create unexpected cultural exchanges as Norse traders and settlers gradually integrate into European societies, bringing their own oral learning traditions that sometimes complement rather than simply destroy existing scholarly networks. You observe Scandinavian craftsmen teaching European metalworkers advanced techniques while learning literacy skills from monastic communities, creating hybrid cultural traditions that blend Viking practicality with Christian scholarship. You discover that some Viking leaders actively collect manuscripts and scholars as valuable resources for their own emerging kingdoms. The Danish king Canute establishes a court school that combines Norse military traditions with Christian learning acquired through raids and diplomatic contacts, creating intellectual synthesis that wouldn't have been possible without the violent disruptions that brought different cultural traditions into contact. The destruction extends beyond individual libraries to entire traditions of regional scholarship that had been developing distinctive approaches to preserving and interpreting classical knowledge. You watch as Celtic learning traditions, which had created unique syntheses of classical philosophy with indigenous wisdom, face systematic disruption that breaks chains of oral transmission that had complemented written preservation efforts. The economic impact of Viking raids undermines the material foundations that had supported European scholarly revival. You observe how monasteries that once funded elaborate copying projects through agricultural surplus and craft production must divert resources toward defensive measures and reconstruction efforts. The wealth that had begun flowing back into intellectual infrastructure gets redirected toward walls, weapons, and emergency supplies that ensure physical survival but cannot support long-term scholarly projects. You witness individual acts of heroism as scholars risk their lives to preserve knowledge during Viking attacks. Brother Columba at the monastery of Bobbio deliberately stays behind during an evacuation to continue copying medical treatises, reasoning that this knowledge might save more lives in the long run than his immediate survival. His sacrifice represents the dedication that keeps European learning alive during its darkest periods. Even as institutional support systems collapse around individual scholars, the raids force European scholars to develop new preservation strategies that disperse knowledge across multiple locations, rather than concentrating it in vulnerable institutional centres. You observe the creation of manuscript networks where identical copies of important texts are distributed among allied monasteries, ensuring that Viking destruction of any single library won't result in permanent knowledge loss. You experience the strange mixture of destruction and preservation that characterises the Viking impact on European learning. While Norse raids devastate individual scriptoriums and disrupt scholarly networks, they also force innovations in preservation techniques, create new cultural exchanges, and ultimately contribute to the geographic spread of learning as scholars flee to new regions and establish intellectual communities in previously non-scholarly areas. You end this section standing in the ruins of the scriptorium at Lindisfarne 50 years after the first raid, watching new monks beginning the slow process of rebuilding their manuscript collection. The Viking threat continues, but these scholars have learned to adapt their preservation efforts to survive in a world where knowledge must be mobile, hidden, and distributed rather than safely concentrated in magnificent institutional libraries. The flames have scattered European learning, but from those scattered embers, more resilient forms of scholarship are slowly emerging. You stand in a muddy field in 9th century Francia, watching a young peasant named Henri desperately trying to repair his plough before the spring planting season ends. His grandfather had been a Roman citizen who could read tax documents and legal codes, but Henri can barely recognise the letters carved into the old plough's iron share, symbols that once represented sophisticated agricultural knowledge accumulated over centuries of imperial farming experience. The social transformation that created feudalism has replaced Rome's knowledge-based administrative system with a survival-focused hierarchy where practical skills matter more than scholarly learning, and swords command more respect than scrolls. The collapse of Roman monetary systems forces European societies to reorganize around land ownership and personal loyalty bonds that have no use for written documentation or complex administrative procedures. You observe how local strongmen establish themselves as feudal lords by controlling agricultural resources and providing military protection, creating power structures that depend on immediate physical capabilities rather than the literacy and bureaucratic expertise that had sustained Roman civilization. When your survival depends on harvesting enough grain to survive winter and defending your village from raiders, abstract learning becomes an unaffordable luxury. Do you remember the linguistic barriers we witnessed fragmenting European intellectual life? Feudalism accelerates this process by creating thousands of tiny political units, each developing its own local customs, dialects, and legal traditions that make centralized education systems impossible to maintain. You travel from one manor to another, observing how communities separated by just 20 miles speak noticeably different dialects and follow completely different legal procedures because they lack the administrative connections that once unified Roman territories under common systems. The feudal manor becomes a self-contained economic unit where practical knowledge takes absolute priority over theoretical learning. You watch the lord of a manor making crucial decisions about crop rotation, livestock breeding, and craft production based on traditional practices passed down through oral tradition rather than written agricultural treatises that his Roman predecessors had consulted. The knowledge isn't necessarily inferior. Many feudal farming techniques represent genuine improvements over Roman methods, but it exists in isolation from broader intellectual traditions that could help systematic improvements. You witness the emergence of a new social hierarchy where military prowess and land ownership determine status rather than education or administrative competence. A feudal knight who can barely write his own name commands more respect and resources than a learned monk who understands mathematics, astronomy, and classical literature. The practical skills required for mounted warfare, castle construction, and agricultural management become more socially valuable than the abstract knowledge that had been prestigious during the Roman period. The feudal emphasis on personal loyalty bonds creates political systems that function through face-to-face relationships, rather than written laws and administrative procedures. You observe how feudal contracts depend on ceremonial oaths and symbolic gestures, kneeling before a lord, placing hands between his hands, exchanging kisses of loyalty rather than the complex legal documents that had regulated Roman imperial administration. Knowledge that cannot be embodied in personal relationships becomes increasingly irrelevant to political and economic life. You experience the intellectual isolation that affects individual manners as feudal self-sufficiency reduces incentives for long-distance trade, communication, and cultural exchange. The lord of a typical manor might never travel more than 50 miles from his birthplace, creating local knowledge bubbles that develop without reference to broader intellectual traditions. Innovations in agricultural technique or craft production remain confined to single communities because the social networks that could spread improvements across larger regions have been replaced by defensive, inward-looking feudal hierarchies. The feudal church adapts to these social changes by emphasizing practical religious services rather than scholarly theological debates. You visit parish churches where local priests focus on performing basic rituals, baptisms, marriages, funeral rites, while lacking the education necessary to engage with complex doctrinal questions that occupied earlier generations of Christian intellectuals. Religion becomes a matter of ceremonial observance rather than intellectual understanding, creating spiritual communities that function without requiring literacy or theological sophistication. Historians still argue whether feudalism represented a rational adaptation to post-Roman social conditions or a regressive retreat from more advanced forms of social organization. But you're witnessing how immediate survival pressures create social systems that necessarily prioritize practical skills over abstract learning. When your community faces constant threats from raiders, rival lords, and natural disasters, investing resources in scholarly education seems like dangerous self-indulgence. You observe how feudal military culture develops its own forms of knowledge that compete with classical learning traditions for social resources and intellectual attention. The training required to become an effective mounted warrior involves complex skills, horsemanship, weapons techniques, tactical coordination, that require years of practice and create genuine expertise. These military knowledge systems command respect and resources because they produce immediately visible results in warfare and territorial defense. The feudal economy's emphasis on agricultural productivity creates practical knowledge traditions that often surpass classical Roman achievements in specific areas. You watch feudal farmers developing three-field crop rotation systems that increase agricultural yields beyond what Roman agricultural treatises had achieved, demonstrating how practical experience can generate innovations that purely theoretical approaches might miss. The problem isn't that feudal knowledge is inferior, it's that it remains isolated from broader intellectual traditions that could help systematic improvement and wider application. You witness the development of craft guilds that preserve and transmit technical knowledge through apprenticeship systems that bypass written documentation entirely. A blacksmith's son learns metallurgy by watching and practicing rather than studying theoretical treatises, creating knowledge transmission systems that work effectively within feudal social structures but cannot easily connect with scholarly traditions preserved in monastic libraries. The feudal legal system develops customary law traditions that function without requiring literacy or reference to written legal codes. You observe manor courts resolving disputes through oral testimony, traditional precedents, and community consensus rather than the complex legal procedures that had characterized Roman jurisprudence. These customary systems often produce fair and effective results, but they cannot benefit from the accumulated legal wisdom preserved in classical texts because the social structures necessary for scholarly legal education no longer exist. You experience the gender implications of feudal knowledge systems as aristocratic women often become more literate than men because their domestic responsibilities include managing household accounts and correspondence, while men focus on military activities that prioritize physical skills over written learning. The Countess Matilda supervises her manor's agricultural planning by consulting written records and calculating crop yields, while her husband leads hunting expeditions and military campaigns that require no literacy whatsoever. The feudal emphasis on personal honor and reputation creates value systems that treat scholarly learning as potentially effeminate or impractical compared to military prowess and physical courage. You observe how young nobles receive education in hunting, fighting, and courtly behavior rather than the classical curriculum that had prepared Roman aristocrats for administrative careers. Knowledge becomes associated with weakness rather than power, creating cultural attitudes that discourage intellectual achievement. You witness the technological innovations that emerge from feudal practical experience, demonstrating how knowledge continues to develop even when separated from classical scholarly traditions. The heavy plough, horseshoe, and stirrup represent genuine technological advances that improve agricultural productivity and military effectiveness, showing how practical intelligence can generate progress even without reference to theoretical learning. The monasteries that preserve classical knowledge become increasingly isolated from the feudal society surrounding them, creating parallel knowledge systems that rarely interact. You observe monks copying Aristotelian treatises in scriptoriums located within feudal territories where local lords make practical decisions without any reference to classical philosophical principles. The knowledge exists in the same geographical space but functions in completely separate social spheres. You discover unexpected ways that feudal social structures sometimes preserve knowledge through non-scholarly channels. Epic poems like the Song of Roland transmit historical information and cultural values through oral performance traditions that reach audiences who cannot read written texts, creating alternative knowledge preservation systems that complement rather than compete with monastic scholarship. The feudal manor court becomes a centre for practical education where young people learn essential life skills through observation and participation rather than formal instruction. You watch children absorbing knowledge about animal husbandry, crop management, craft production, and social relationships through daily participation in manor life, creating educational systems that work effectively within feudal social structures, even though they cannot connect with broader scholarly traditions. You experience the economic calculations that make feudal prioritization of practical knowledge rational from individual perspectives. A feudal lord who invests resources in military training and agricultural improvement can expect immediate returns in the form of increased security and productivity, while investment in scholarly education produces no obvious practical benefits within feudal social systems. The knowledge choices that seem regressive from historical perspective make perfect sense within contemporary economic constraints. You end this section observing a feudal court where practical decisions about land management, military organization, and legal disputes are made through oral consultation and traditional precedent rather than reference to written authorities or scholarly analysis. The knowledge systems that sustain feudal society work effectively within their own context, but they operate in complete isolation from the classical intellectual traditions that monks continue preserving in distant scriptoriums, creating parallel worlds of knowledge that rarely intersect or inform each other. You stand in the scriptorium of the Abbey of Saint Denis around 1150 CE, watching Abbot Sugar carefully examine a manuscript containing Aristotle's logical treatises before deciding whether this pagan philosopher's ideas deserve preservation or should be scraped off the parchment to make room for more appropriate Christian texts. The quill trembles in his hand as he weighs centuries of church doctrine against the intellectual curiosity that draws him to these ancient Greek arguments about the nature of reality and reasoning. This moment captures the fundamental tension that has shaped European intellectual life for centuries, the Church's role as both guardian and gatekeeper of classical knowledge. Simultaneously preserving ancient wisdom and controlling access to ideas that might challenge religious orthodoxy. The Christian Church's control over literacy and education gives religious authorities unprecedented power to determine which ancient ideas survive and which disappear into historical oblivion. You observe how bishops and abbots make crucial decisions about manuscript copying priorities, often choosing to preserve classical texts that support Christian theology, while allowing works that contradict religious doctrine to deteriorate through neglect. Plato's philosophical idealism survives because it can be interpreted as supporting Christian concepts of eternal spiritual reality. While materialist philosophers like Democritus disappear because atomic theory seems to contradict divine creation, do you remember the monastic scriptoriums we visited, where dedicated monks preserved classical learning through patient copying efforts? Now you witness how those same institutions have become intellectual bottlenecks, where religious authorities filter ancient knowledge through doctrinal considerations that determine what future generations will be allowed to learn. The process isn't necessarily malicious. Many church leaders genuinely believe they're protecting society from dangerous ideas, but the cumulative effect creates systematic gaps in knowledge preservation that will haunt European intellectual development for centuries. The Church's educational monopoly means that virtually all literate Europeans receive their training within religious institutions that embed classical learning within Christian interpretive frameworks. You attend cathedral schools, where young clerics study Aristotelian logic as preparation for theological debates, rather than as tools for understanding the natural world, creating educational traditions that treat ancient philosophy as a means to religious ends rather than valuable knowledge in its own right. Students learn to read Greek mathematical treatises through the lens of Christian numerology, interpreting geometric principles as symbols of divine perfection rather than practical tools for engineering and construction. You witness the development of scholastic philosophy as Christian intellectuals attempt to reconcile classical learning with religious doctrine, creating elaborate theoretical systems that synthesize Aristotelian reasoning with biblical revelation. Thomas Aquinas spends decades developing arguments that demonstrate how ancient Greek philosophy actually supports Christian theology. Producing monumental scholarly works that preserve classical ideas by demonstrating their compatibility with religious truth. But this preservation comes at the cost of intellectual freedom. Classical texts survive only insofar as they can be made to serve Christian purposes. The Church's control extends beyond education to the very production and distribution of books, creating ecclesiastical censorship systems that determine which texts get copied, where they're housed, and who gains access to them. You observe how monastery libraries become theological fortresses where classical texts are chained to reading desks and available only to scholars who can demonstrate religious orthodoxy and official permission to study potentially dangerous ideas. Knowledge becomes a privilege granted by religious authority rather than a resource available to anyone with curiosity and ability. Historians still argue whether church control over classical learning represented necessary cultural adaptation or deliberate intellectual suppression. But you witness clear evidence of systematic efforts to subordinate ancient wisdom to religious doctrine. When classical texts contradict Christian teaching, church authorities consistently choose religious orthodoxy over intellectual honesty, creating knowledge preservation systems that save ancient wisdom only when it can be made compatible with medieval theology. You experience the psychological impact of studying within ecclesiastical intellectual frameworks that treat curiosity about the natural world as potentially sinful unless directed toward religious purposes. A young monk named Brother Francis explains how he struggles with guilt when he finds himself more interested in Ptolemy's astronomical observations than in their theological implications, creating internal conflicts between intellectual curiosity and religious devotion that limit scholarly investigation even within church institutions. The Church's emphasis on scriptural authority creates hierarchies of knowledge that place biblical revelation above empirical observation or rational analysis, making systematic natural philosophy virtually impossible within Christian educational frameworks. You watch scholars at the Cathedral School of Chartres performing elaborate intellectual gymnastics to reconcile Ptolemaic astronomy with biblical descriptions of cosmic structure, demonstrating how religious constraints force intellectually dishonest approaches to natural investigation. You observe how church doctrine shapes the preservation priorities that determine which classical texts receive careful copying and commentary, while others are allowed to disappear through neglect. Medical treatises that describe anatomy through dissection get lower priority than philosophical works that can be interpreted as supporting spiritual rather than material approaches to human nature. Scientific texts that emphasize observation and experimentation receive less attention than theoretical works that can be read as demonstrations of divine rational design. The Church's control over translation projects determines how classical knowledge gets transmitted across linguistic and cultural boundaries, with ecclesiastical authorities ensuring that potentially dangerous ideas are either eliminated or surrounded with Christian interpretive commentary that neutralizes their intellectual threat. You watch as translators working under church supervision systematically modify classical text to remove passages that contradict religious doctrine, creating improved versions that preserve the form of ancient learning while eliminating its substance. You witness the emergence of intellectual double standards, where church scholars privately study classical texts that they publicly condemn, creating underground knowledge networks within ecclesiastical institutions. The Bishop of Paris maintains a secret library containing works by Arabic philosophers and pagan scientists that he officially considers heretical, demonstrating how institutional religious authority sometimes conflicts with individual intellectual curiosity, even within the church hierarchy itself. The ecclesiastical legal system develops elaborate procedures for investigating suspected intellectual heresy, creating bureaucratic mechanisms that discourage scholarly exploration of ideas that might challenge religious orthodoxy. You observe heresy trials where scholars face persecution not for immoral behaviour but for expressing ideas derived from careful study of classical texts, demonstrating how religious authority treats certain forms of knowledge as inherently dangerous, regardless of their scholarly merit. You experience the ironic situation where Christian institutions preserve classical learning while simultaneously preventing its full utilization for advancing human understanding of the natural world. The Church maintains libraries containing sophisticated Greek scientific treatises while forbidding the experimental investigations that could test and improve ancient theories. Creating intellectual museums rather than active research institutions, the Church's educational philosophy treats ancient wisdom as a finished revelation from the past rather than a foundation for continued intellectual development, discouraging the innovation and experimentation that had characterized classical learning at its best. You watch Christian scholars spending decades writing commentaries on Aristotelian texts without ever attempting the direct observations that might verify or improve upon ancient theories, creating scholastic traditions that preserve the letter of classical learning while abandoning its spirit. You observe how religious art and architecture become vehicles for preserving classical, mathematical and scientific knowledge in forms that bypass ecclesiastical censorship. The geometric principles embedded in Gothic cathedral construction preserve sophisticated mathematical concepts that might be suppressed if presented as purely secular knowledge, demonstrating how practical applications sometimes protect theoretical understanding from religious persecution. The monastic rule systems that govern scholarly life within church institutions create daily routines that subordinate intellectual work to religious observance, ensuring that classical learning never becomes an end in itself, but always serves spiritual purposes. You follow the daily schedule at a Benedictine monastery where manuscript copying must stop for prayer services every few hours, preventing the sustained intellectual concentration that serious scholarly work requires. You witness the development of Christian allegorical interpretation techniques that transform classical texts into religious documents by reading spiritual meanings into ancient secular works. Virgil's Aeneid becomes a Christian allegory about the soul's journey towards salvation, while Ovid's Metamorphoses gets interpreted as symbolizing spiritual transformation through divine grace. These interpretive methods preserve classical literature by making it religiously acceptable, but they also obscure the original meanings that made ancient works intellectually valuable. The Church's control over book production and distribution creates regional variations in knowledge availability, as different ecclesiastical authorities make different decisions about which classical texts deserve preservation and study. You travel between monasteries and discover that classical works freely available in one religious institution may be completely unknown in another, creating arbitrary patterns of knowledge distribution determined by individual church leaders' intellectual preferences and doctrinal interpretations. You experience the cultural consequences of ecclesiastical knowledge control as European societies develop intellectual traditions that treat curiosity about the natural world as potentially impious, unless subordinated to religious purposes. This creates social atmospheres where scientific investigation becomes associated with spiritual danger, discouraging the empirical research that could advance human understanding of natural phenomena. You end this section in a monastery library where ancient Greek scientific treatises sit chained to reading desks beneath crosses and religious symbols, representing the complex relationship between Christian authority and classical learning that simultaneously preserves and constrains ancient wisdom. The Church has kept classical knowledge alive through centuries of social chaos, but at the cost of intellectual freedom that ancient scholarship had taken for granted. creating preserved but domesticated versions of human learning that serve religious purposes rather than advancing human understanding of the natural world. You smell the sickly sweet stench of death hanging over Florence in 1348 as you watch Brother Alessandro, the monastery's most skilled scribe, succumb to the Black Death after copying only half of Ptolemy's Almagest, a mathematical treasure that had taken him 3 years to obtain from Byzantine scholars and will now remain incomplete for another century. The Great Mortality, as contemporaries call this catastrophe, is systematically destroying the human infrastructure that has sustained European knowledge preservation for centuries, wiping out entire generations of scholars, scribes, teachers, and students whose accumulated expertise cannot be quickly replaced. The plague strikes with terrifying efficiency at precisely the communities most essential for knowledge preservation. Densely populated monasteries where scholars work in close proximity, cathedral schools where students live together in the crowded dormitories, and university towns where intellectual networks depend on face-to-face interaction. You watch the Abbey of St. Gall, one of Europe's premier centres of learning, lose 2/3 of its monks within 6 months, including the master librarian whose detailed knowledge of the manuscript collection dies with him, leaving survivors unable to locate essential texts that had been carefully organised according to his personal system. Do you remember the Church's control over knowledge that we witnessed shaping European intellectual life? The Black Death devastates the ecclesiastical institutions that had become the primary guardians of classical learning, creating intellectual chaos that compounds the pandemic's physical destruction. You observe how entire monastic libraries become inaccessible when the last monks who understood their organisation succumb to plague, transforming carefully preserved knowledge collections into mysterious mazes that survivors cannot navigate effectively. The economic devastation accompanying pandemic mortality undermines the material foundations that had supported scholarly work across Europe. You witness wealthy patrons who had funded manuscript copying projects dying without heirs, leaving half-completed scholarly works abandoned in scriptoriums where surviving scribes lack resources to continue expensive copying operations. The complex financial networks that had enabled scholars to travel between institutions, purchase rare texts, and maintain correspondence with distant colleagues collapse as trade networks fail and monetary systems break down under demographic catastrophe. You experience the psychological trauma that affects surviving scholars as they watch centuries of careful preservation work threatened by social collapse. Master Albertus at the University of Paris explains how he no longer has the heart to begin copying projects that might take years to complete, when plague could return at any time to destroy both his work and his life. The long-term planning that knowledge preservation requires becomes psychologically impossible when death seems to strike randomly and continuously. The plague creates cascading educational crises as teaching institutions lose the critical mass necessary to maintain scholarly communities. You visit universities where entire faculties have died, leaving students without instructors and breaking chains of knowledge transmission that had connected generations of scholars. The University of Oxford loses so many masters that surviving students cannot complete their degrees, creating gaps in educational continuity that interrupt scholarly traditions that had been developing for centuries. Historians still argue whether the Black Death represented simply a temporary interruption in European intellectual development, or a fundamental turning point that permanently altered knowledge preservation systems. But you're witnessing clear evidence of transformative disruption that goes far beyond temporary personnel shortages. Entire scholarly specializations disappear when the last practitioners die without trained successors, creating permanent gaps in European learning that will require centuries to fill. You observe how pandemic mortality accelerates existing trends toward intellectual isolation as surviving scholarly communities become too small and scattered to maintain the networks necessary for collaborative research and knowledge exchange. Monasteries that had shared manuscripts and scholarly expertise now lack sufficient personnel to maintain their own collections, much less participate in broader intellectual cooperation that had slowly been rebuilding European learning networks. The social chaos accompanying pandemic mortality creates security problems that threaten physical survival of manuscript collections, even when human guardians survive. You watch bandits looting abandoned monasteries for anything valuable, using priceless manuscripts as kindling for campfires because they lack literacy necessary to recognize intellectual treasures. Libraries that survived Viking raids and political warfare succumb to simple lawlessness when social order breaks down under demographic pressure. You witness the desperate measures that surviving scholars adopt to preserve knowledge when institutional support systems collapse. A dying monk named Brother Thomas spends his final weeks creating abbreviated summaries of essential texts because he realizes no one will have time to copy complete works during the social emergency. These compression efforts save some knowledge but necessarily sacrifice the detail and nuance that made original texts valuable. Creating simplified versions that preserve basic information while losing intellectual sophistication. The plague's impact on urban centres proves particularly devastating for knowledge preservation because cities had become increasingly important centres of learning that complemented traditional monastic scholarship. You watch Florence, which had developed into a major intellectual hub, combining commercial wealth with scholarly activity, lose the human networks necessary to maintain its manuscript collections and scholarly institutions. The urban intellectual culture that had been emerging as an alternative to ecclesiastical learning faces near extinction under pandemic pressure. You experience the ironic situation where plague mortality creates opportunities for rapid social advancement that might have taken generations under normal circumstances. But these opportunities come at the cost of traditional knowledge transmission systems. Young scholars suddenly find themselves in positions of authority they're not prepared to handle, becoming abbots and university masters without the decades of careful training that had prepared previous generations for scholarly leadership. The geographical spread of plague mortality creates random patterns of knowledge preservation and loss that have nothing to do with intellectual merit or scholarly importance. You observe how some manuscript collections survive intact simply because they happen to be located in regions that escape the worst pandemic mortality, while equally valuable libraries disappear completely because local communities lack sufficient survivors to maintain them. You witness the development of what scholars call plague psychology, mental attitudes shaped by constant proximity to death that discourage long-term intellectual projects in favour of immediate spiritual preparation for mortality. Surviving scholars increasingly focus on devotional works and practical religious instruction rather than the abstract philosophical and scientific inquiries that had characterised earlier medieval intellectual life. The breakdown of international trade networks that accompany pandemic mortality isolates European scholarly communities from the Islamic and Byzantine sources that had been providing access to classical texts unavailable in Western libraries. You watch as communication networks that had enabled European scholars to obtain Arabic translations of Greek works collapse under commercial and demographic disruption, cutting off knowledge flows that had been gradually reintroducing classical learning to Western Europe. You observe how plague mortality creates lasting changes in European educational priorities as surviving institutions focus on training clergy for immediate pastoral needs rather than advanced scholarly research. The practical requirements of ministering to traumatized populations take precedence over abstract intellectual pursuits, creating educational systems that emphasize pastoral care over scholarly achievement. The demographic catastrophe forces fundamental changes in manuscript production techniques. As scriptoriums lacking sufficient trained scribes experiment with simplified copying methods that sacrifice beauty and precision for speed and efficiency, you watch surviving monks developing abbreviated writing systems and standardized layouts that enable faster text reproduction but necessarily reduce the careful attention to detail that had characterized earlier medieval manuscripts. You witness the emergence of lay literacy as plague mortality creates labour shortages that force non-clerical populations to take on administrative and educational roles previously monopolised by church institutions. This democratisation of literacy has long-term benefits for knowledge preservation, but it also disrupts traditional scholarly hierarchies and quality control systems that had maintained intellectual standards. The psychological impact of witnessing social collapse affects surviving scholars' approaches to knowledge preservation as they increasingly view classical learning as irrelevant luxury during civilizational emergency. You observe how practical survival concerns take precedence over abstract intellectual pursuits, creating cultural attitudes that will discourage scholarly achievement for generations after the pandemic's immediate mortality crisis passes. You experience the strange mixture of destruction and opportunity that characterizes plague's impact on European intellectual life. While pandemic mortality devastates existing scholarly institutions, it also creates openings for intellectual innovation and social change that might have been impossible under normal circumstances. The rigid hierarchies that had controlled knowledge access weaken under demographic pressure, creating opportunities for new approaches to learning and knowledge preservation. The medical impact of plague creates urgent practical needs for knowledge that European scholarly communities cannot adequately meet because they lack access to classical medical treatises and practical treatment experience. You watch physicians desperately consulting incomplete manuscripts and unreliable folk remedies because the sophisticated medical knowledge preserved in Islamic libraries remains inaccessible to European practitioners facing unprecedented health crisis. You end this section standing in a half-empty scriptorium where a single surviving monk continues copying manuscripts by candlelight, surrounded by empty writing desks that once supported a thriving scholarly community. His persistence represents the stubborn human refusal to abandon knowledge preservation, even when death surrounds him, but also illustrates how precarious the threads have become that connect European societies to their classical intellectual heritage. The Black Death has scattered the guardians of knowledge like autumn leaves, leaving future generations to slowly gather the fragments and rebuild what pandemic mortality has torn apart. You stand on the walls of Constantinople in 1453, watching Turkish cannons pound the massive fortifications that have protected the Byzantine Empire for over 1,000 years, while Emperor Constantine V desperately burns ancient Greek manuscripts to keep warm during the final siege. The last remnant of the Roman Empire is about to fall, and with it will disappear the final institutional guardian of classical Greek learning that has survived unbroken since antiquity. The irony cuts deep. While Western Europe stumbles through intellectual recovery, the Byzantine Empire has maintained direct continuity with ancient scholarship, preserving complete texts of Greek philosophers, historians, and scientists that have been lost everywhere else in the Christian world. The Byzantine Empire's unique position as the inheritor of both Roman administrative systems and Greek intellectual traditions has made Constantinople the world's greatest repository of classical learning outside the Islamic world. You explore the Imperial Library, where scribes still copy texts in ancient Greek rather than the corrupted Latin that dominates Western European scholarship, maintaining linguistic connections to original sources that Western scholars can only access through multiple layers of translation and interpretation. Here, Plato's dialogues exist in manuscripts that preserve nuances of meaning impossible to capture in Latin translations, while complete versions of lost Greek historical works provide perspectives on ancient events that Western Europe has forgotten entirely. Do you remember the fragmentation of learning we witnessed as Viking raids and feudal isolation broke apart European scholarly networks. The Byzantine Empire represents the opposite trajectory, a civilization that maintained institutional continuity with classical antiquity, even as Western Europe forgot its own intellectual heritage. You observe how Byzantine scholars still debate Aristotelian philosophy using terminology and concepts that trace directly back to ancient Athens, creating scholarly traditions that bridge antiquity and the medieval period without the dramatic breaks that characterize Western European intellectual history. The empire's position between Europe and Asia has created unique opportunities for intellectual synthesis as Byzantine scholars serve as intermediaries between Islamic learning centers and the slowly recovering intellectual communities of Western Europe. You witness scholarly exchanges where Greek-speaking Byzantine intellectuals translate Arabic philosophical treatises back into the language of their original sources, recovering classical texts that had been lost in their original Greek but preserved in Islamic libraries. These translation projects represent remarkable intellectual archaeology, reconstructing ancient wisdom from fragments preserved across different cultural traditions. You experience the strange cultural atmosphere of a civilization that simultaneously represents profound continuity with antiquity and desperate struggle for survival against overwhelming military pressure. Byzantine scholars continue copying ancient Greek texts, even as Turkish armies approach Constantinople's walls, demonstrating intellectual dedication that transcends immediate political circumstances. The emperor himself patronizes scholarly projects that seem almost surreal given the empire's desperate military situation, funding translation initiatives and library expansions, while his territories shrink under relentless Ottoman pressure. The Byzantine educational system preserves classical pedagogical traditions that have vanished everywhere else in the Christian world. You attend lectures at the University of Constantinople, where students still study rhetoric using the same textbooks that had trained administrators for the original Roman Empire, creating direct educational connections across more than 1,000 years of historical continuity. These educational traditions produce scholars capable of reading ancient Greek texts with a fluency impossible for Western European intellectuals who encounter classical learning through Latin translations and medieval interpretive frameworks. Historians still argue whether Byzantine intellectual achievements represent genuine scholarly advancement or simply superior preservation of existing classical knowledge. But you witness clear evidence of original thinking that extends ancient traditions rather than merely copying them. Byzantine theologians develop sophisticated philosophical syntheses that combine Greek patristic theology with contemporary intellectual challenges, while Byzantine historians create analytical frameworks for understanding political and military developments that draw upon both classical historiographical methods and contemporary experience. You observe how the empire's long struggle for survival against Islamic expansion has created intellectual exchange networks that transcend religious boundaries. As Byzantine and Islamic scholars maintain scholarly correspondence and collaborative projects despite ongoing military conflicts between their political systems, these intellectual relationships demonstrate how scholarly communities can maintain professional cooperation even when their societies face existential military threats, creating knowledge preservation networks that survive political hostilities. The gradual territorial contraction of the Byzantine Empire creates refugee communities of Greek scholars who carry classical learning to Western European centres where their linguistic skills and manuscript collections provide access to texts that had been unavailable for centuries. You follow a Byzantine scholar named Maximos Planudes as he travels to Italy with a collection of Greek mathematical treatises that introduce Western European scholars to advanced techniques that had been lost since antiquity, creating intellectual bridges that reconnect separated branches of the classical tradition. You witness the development of what scholars call the Byzantine Renaissance, periods of intellectual flowering that occur even as the empire faces increasing political and military pressures. These scholarly revivals demonstrate how intellectual life can flourish despite external threats. As Greek scholars produce important commentaries on ancient texts, develop new approaches to classical problems, and maintain scholarly institutions that preserve learning through periods of severe political crisis. The empire's unique position as a Christian society that maintained classical Greek as its scholarly language creates intellectual opportunities impossible elsewhere in the medieval world. You observe how Byzantine theologians can read early Christian texts in their original Greek without the translation barriers that limit Western European understanding of patristic theology, while Byzantine physicians have access to complete Greek medical treatises that survive only in fragments or inferior translations elsewhere. You experience the tragedy of watching irreplaceable intellectual treasures face imminent destruction as Turkish armies approach Constantinople. The Imperial Library contains unique manuscripts of classical authors whose works exist nowhere else, complete histories, scientific treatises, philosophical commentaries that represent the sole surviving copies of ancient Greek learning. You watch scholars making desperate decisions about which manuscripts to save and which must be abandoned, knowing that their choices will determine what knowledge survives the empire's fall. The Byzantine legal system preserves Roman jurisprudential traditions that have been corrupted or lost in Western Europe. Maintaining institutional knowledge about legal principles and administrative procedures that trace back to the original Roman Empire, you observe how Byzantine legal scholars continue developing sophisticated approaches to jurisprudence that build upon classical foundations while addressing contemporary legal challenges, creating legal traditions that represent genuine continuity with ancient Roman legal achievements. You witness the cultural exchanges that occur as Western European scholars travel to Constantinople, seeking access to Greek manuscripts unavailable in their home libraries. These intellectual pilgrimages create knowledge transfer networks that slowly reintroduce classical learning to Western Europe. But they also highlight the dramatic gaps that have developed between Eastern and Western Christian intellectual traditions over centuries of separation. The empire's survival strategies include diplomatic initiatives that use intellectual resources as political tools, offering access to rare manuscripts and scholarly expertise in exchange for military or financial support from Western European powers. You observe how knowledge becomes a form of diplomatic currency that helps sustain the empire's precarious political position, demonstrating the political value that sophisticated intellectual traditions can provide to societies under external pressure. You experience the psychological impact of representing the last institutional connection to classical antiquity while facing probable extinction. Byzantine scholars work with the knowledge that their defeat might mean the permanent loss of intellectual traditions that have survived for over a millennium, creating scholarly communities that combine deep historical awareness with immediate existential anxiety. The empire's multilingual scholarly communities create unique intellectual environments where Greek, Latin, Arabic, and vernacular languages interact in ways impossible elsewhere in the medieval world. You observe scholars who can compare different translations of the same classical text, identifying translation errors and recovering original meanings through linguistic analysis that requires expertise in multiple scholarly traditions. You witness the emergence of what will become known as the Great Greek Exodus, as Byzantine scholars begin fleeing to Western Europe carrying manuscript collections that will help fuel the Italian Renaissance. These intellectual refugees represent living bridges between ancient and modern learning, bringing not just texts, but also the linguistic and interpretive skills necessary to unlock their full meaning. The empire's artistic traditions preserve classical aesthetic principles and technical knowledge that have been lost elsewhere, creating visual representations of ancient learning that complement textual preservation efforts. You observe how Byzantine illuminated manuscripts maintain decorative traditions that trace back to ancient Greek artistic principles, preserving visual knowledge about classical culture that purely textual sources cannot convey. You end this section watching the last Byzantine scholars packing manuscripts into leather satchels as Turkish cannons breach Constantinople's ancient walls. These intellectual refugees carry with them the final fragments of unbroken continuity with classical Greek learning, preparing to transplant ancient wisdom into Renaissance European soil where it will help trigger intellectual revolutions they cannot imagine. The Byzantine Empire dies, but the knowledge it preserved for 1,000 years travels west to plant seeds of intellectual renaissance in societies finally ready to receive the classical heritage they had lost centuries before. You march alongside a Crusader army toward Jerusalem in 1099, your sword heavy at your side and a prayer on your lips. But what transforms your world view isn't the conquest of holy places. It's the moment you enter a library in Antioch and discover Arabic translations of Greek philosophical texts that European scholars have been desperately seeking for centuries. The armed pilgrimage you joined to reclaim Christian sacred sites becomes an accidental intellectual expedition as Western European warriors encounter the sophisticated learning centres that Islamic civilization has built while Europe struggled through its darkest centuries. The First Crusade brings European knights into direct contact with Islamic libraries containing treasures that had become legendary in Western monasteries, complete works by Aristotle, advanced mathematical treatises, medical knowledge that surpasses anything available in European centres of learning. You watch a Norman knight named Robert stare in amazement at shelves of books in the library of a captured Syrian city. Unable to read Arabic script, but recognizing Greek letters in marginal notes that indicate these manuscripts contain the classical texts his scholars back home know only through incomplete Latin fragments. Do you remember the Islamic Golden Age we witness preserving and advancing classical knowledge while Europe stumbled through intellectual darkness? Now, those carefully preserved treasures face the chaos of military conquest as Crusader armies capture cities without understanding the intellectual wealth they contain. You observe both tragic destruction and remarkable preservation, as some Crusaders burn libraries they consider repositories of infidel learning, while others recognize the value of manuscripts and arrange for their protection and eventual translation. The cultural shock works both ways as Muslim scholars encounter European intellectual traditions they had previously known only through second-hand reports. You witness learned debates between captured Islamic philosophers and European clerics who discover that their supposed enemies possess sophisticated knowledge of Aristotelian logic and Christian theological texts, creating intellectual exchanges that transcend the religious hostilities motivating military campaigns. A Syrian scholar named Ibn Rushd explains Aristotelian arguments to a French abbot with such clarity that the Christian monk begins questioning whether European educational methods adequately prepare scholars for serious philosophical investigation. You experience the practical challenges of cross-cultural knowledge transfer as Crusader scholars attempt to acquire Islamic manuscripts without adequate linguistic preparation or cultural understanding. The Abbey of Monte Cassino sends Brother William to acquire Greek texts from conquered libraries, but his inability to read Arabic forces him to rely on local Christian translators whose theological biases systematically distort the philosophical content he's trying to preserve. The Crusader states that emerge from military conquest become unexpected centres of intellectual exchange as European colonists encounter Islamic educational institutions they cannot simply destroy without eliminating the administrative expertise necessary for governing conquered territories. You observe how the Kingdom of Jerusalem maintains Islamic schools and libraries because Crusader administrators need local scholars who can read Arabic legal documents and manage complex irrigation systems that European settlers don't understand. Historians still argue whether Crusader contact with Islamic learning represented primarily accidental cultural exchange or deliberate intellectual acquisition. But you witness clear evidence of systematic efforts by some European scholars to use military conquest as an opportunity for accessing knowledge unavailable in Western libraries. The Archbishop of Toledo sponsors translation projects that convert captured Arabic manuscripts into Latin versions that can be studied in European monasteries, creating knowledge acquisition programs that parallel military campaigns. You witness the development of translation centers in Crusader-controlled cities where European, Islamic, and Eastern Christian scholars collaborate on converting Arabic texts into Latin versions suitable for European educational systems. These translation workshops represent remarkable intellectual cooperation that emerges from military conflict. As former enemies discover shared interests in preserving and transmitting classical knowledge across cultural boundaries, the military pressure of constant warfare creates urgent practical needs for knowledge that Islamic learning centers can provide, but European education cannot adequately supply. You watch Crusader physicians consulting Arabic medical treatises because Islamic surgical techniques and pharmaceutical preparations prove superior to European folk remedies for treating battle wounds and epidemic diseases that devastate military camps. You observe how Crusader encounters with Islamic architecture and engineering create demand for technical knowledge that European craftsmen lack. The sophisticated fortification systems, hydraulic engineering, and construction techniques visible in Islamic cities demonstrate technological capabilities that European military engineers want to understand and reproduce, creating practical incentives for technical knowledge transfer. The religious context of crusading creates complex intellectual problems, as European scholars struggle to reconcile their discovery of Islamic philosophical sophistication with theological assumptions about infidel intellectual inferiority. You witness Christian scholars experiencing cognitive dissonance as they encounter Muslim philosophers whose understanding of Aristotelian logic exceeds their own, forcing uncomfortable questions about whether religious truth necessarily corresponds to intellectual achievement. You experience the emergence of what scholars call Crusader cosmopolitanism, as prolonged contact with Islamic societies transforms European intellectual assumptions about cultural superiority and religious monopoly on truth. Knights who initially viewed Muslims as ignorant barbarians gradually develop respect for Islamic learning achievements, creating cultural attitudes that prepare the ground for more systematic intellectual exchanges. The commercial networks that develop alongside military conquest create knowledge transfer mechanisms that outlast specific military campaigns. You observe how Italian merchants establish trading relationships with Islamic scholars, purchasing manuscripts and technical treatises that find their way into European libraries through commercial rather than military channels, creating sustainable networks for continuing intellectual exchange. You witness the tragic irony that military conquest sometimes destroys the very knowledge systems that made Islamic societies intellectually valuable. As warfare disrupts scholarly communities and scatters manuscript collections that had been carefully preserved for centuries, the Library of Tripoli burns during the Crusader siege, destroying unique mathematical treatises that represented centuries of scholarly development. The linguistic barriers that separate Crusader scholars from Islamic learning create translation challenges that often distort the knowledge being transmitted. You watch European translators struggling to find Latin terminology adequate for expressing Arabic philosophical concepts, creating hybrid intellectual vocabularies that preserve basic ideas while losing nuanced meanings that made original texts intellectually sophisticated. You observe how Crusader military experiences create practical knowledge that complements the theoretical learning acquired through manuscript acquisition. European knights develop understanding of siege warfare, naval tactics, and desert survival techniques through direct experience in Middle Eastern campaigns, creating practical knowledge traditions that enhance the theoretical military knowledge preserved in classical texts. The political fragmentation of Crusader states creates competitive incentives for intellectual acquisition, as different European rulers attempt to attract scholars and acquire manuscript collections that provide diplomatic prestige and administrative advantages. You witness scholarly competitions where Crusader lords compete to establish the most impressive libraries and translation centres. Using intellectual resources as symbols of political legitimacy, you experience the social tensions that arise when returning Crusaders bring Islamic learning back to European intellectual communities, unprepared for such sophisticated challenges to their established scholarly traditions. Monks who had spent generations copying corrupted Latin texts suddenly encounter Arabic versions of the same works that reveal the inadequacy of their manuscript traditions, creating institutional crises within European educational systems. The Crusader encounter with Islamic medicine creates urgent demands for knowledge that European medical traditions cannot adequately supply. You observe how European physicians returning from the Holy Land attempt to establish medical schools that combine traditional European approaches with Islamic techniques, creating hybrid medical traditions that improve European healthcare, but also challenge traditional authorities who lack such sophisticated knowledge. You witness the development of Crusader chronicles that attempt to record not just military events, but also intellectual discoveries made through contact with Islamic societies. These historical accounts create European awareness of Islamic learning achievements, while also distorting Islamic intellectual traditions through Christian interpretive frameworks that cannot adequately comprehend non-Christian philosophical systems. The technological knowledge acquired through Crusader contact with Islamic societies creates practical applications that transform European military and civilian capabilities. You observe how European engineers apply Islamic architectural techniques to castle construction, while European craftsmen adopt Islamic metallurgical methods that improve weapon and tool production. You experience the long-term cultural impact of Crusader intellectual exchanges as European scholars begin developing more sophisticated approaches to philosophical and scientific investigation based on methods learned from Islamic sources. The logical techniques and empirical approaches that characterize later medieval European scholarship trace back to knowledge acquired through Crusader contact with Islamic learning centers. The religious tensions created by discovering Islamic intellectual sophistication force European scholars to develop more nuanced theological approaches to understanding the relationship between religious truth and philosophical knowledge. You observe how Christian theologians begin creating theoretical frameworks that can acknowledge Islamic learning achievements while maintaining Christian doctrinal superiority, producing complex intellectual syntheses that will influence European thought for centuries. You end this section watching a ship loaded with manuscripts sail from Acre toward Venice, carrying Arabic translations of Greek philosophical works that will transform European intellectual life in ways the Crusader knights who acquired them cannot imagine. The holy war that began as religious conflict has become an accidental bridge between separated intellectual traditions, reconnecting European scholars to the classical heritage they had lost while simultaneously introducing them to Islamic innovations that will help transform medieval scholarship into Renaissance humanism. You sit in a cramped scriptorium in 12th century Toledo, watching Gerard of Cremona carefully compare three different versions of the same Aristotelian text, one in corrupted Latin, one in Arabic, and fragments of the original Greek, as he attempts to create a translation that captures the philosophical precision lost through centuries of linguistic confusion. The intense concentration on his weathered face reflects the magnitude of his task, recovering the intellectual heritage of classical antiquity by systematically converting Arabic preservations of Greek wisdom back into Latin versions that European scholars can finally understand. This is the Great Translation Movement, perhaps history's most ambitious knowledge recovery project, where teams of multilingual scholars work to bridge the gap between Islamic preservation of classical learning and European hunger for their own forgotten intellectual traditions. The translation centres emerging across newly reconquered Spanish territories represent unprecedented cooperation between scholars from Christian, Islamic, and Jewish traditions who share common dedication to making ancient wisdom accessible across cultural boundaries. You observe the collaborative atmosphere in Toledo's House of Translation, where a Muslim philosopher explains Averroes' commentary on Aristotle to a Jewish scholar who then works with a Christian monk to create Latin versions that preserve both the original Greek meaning and the Islamic interpretive insights that have improved upon ancient understanding. Do you remember the Crusader encounters we witnessed accidentally revealing Islamic intellectual treasures to amazed European knights? Now those chance discoveries have evolved into systematic scholarly enterprises as European institutions sponsor professional translation projects designed to recover the classical learning that their own cultural traditions had lost or corrupted. King Alfonso X of Castile funds translation teams that work with industrial efficiency, converting Arabic mathematical, astronomical, and philosophical texts into Latin versions that will transform European intellectual life. You witness the technical challenges that translators face when attempting to render Arabic philosophical terminology into Latin vocabulary that often lacks adequate concepts for expressing sophisticated Islamic developments of Greek ideas. A Jewish translator named Abraham ibn Daud spends weeks developing Latin neologisms that can capture the precise meanings of Arabic terms that have no classical equivalents, creating hybrid intellectual vocabularies that will become standard in European philosophical discourse. The magnitude of lost knowledge becomes apparent as translators discover how much classical learning had vanished from European libraries while being carefully preserved and improved in Islamic centres. You watch Christian scholars experiencing genuine shock as they encounter complete versions of Aristotle's works that contain sections they never knew existed, while Arabic commentaries reveal levels of sophistication in logical analysis that medieval European education had never achieved. Historians still argue whether the translation movement represented primarily Islamic generosity toward European intellectual poverty or European appropriation of Islamic scholarly achievements. But you witness clear evidence of genuine collaboration as Islamic scholars actively participate in converting their own intellectual traditions into forms accessible to European learning communities. These aren't conquest relationships. They're scholarly partnerships driven by shared recognition that knowledge belongs to all humanity, regardless of religious or cultural boundaries. You observe the emergence of specialized translation techniques as scholars develop systematic methods for preserving meaning across multiple linguistic and cultural transformations. The translator Adelard of Bath creates detailed guidelines for maintaining philosophical precision while converting Arabic mathematical terminology into Latin concepts that can be understood by European scholars unfamiliar with Islamic numerical systems and algebraic approaches. The economic support for translation projects demonstrates how European rulers recognize the practical value of recovering classical knowledge that can improve administration, military capabilities, and technological development. You watch Emperor Frederick II investing enormous resources in translation centres because he understands that Islamic preservation of classical learning provides access to engineering techniques, medical knowledge, and philosophical systems that European societies desperately need for cultural advancement. You experience the intellectual excitement that permeates European scholarly communities as translated texts reveal the sophisticated character of classical learning that had been reduced to fragments and corrupted summaries in European libraries. A Parisian master named Peter Abelard describes his amazement at discovering complete logical treatises that resolve philosophical problems European scholars had been debating based on inadequate textual sources. The translation movement creates new forms of international scholarly cooperation as European institutions establish permanent relationships with Islamic libraries and learning centres. You observe how the Cathedral School of Chartres maintains ongoing correspondence with scholars in Cordoba, creating knowledge exchange networks that transcend political boundaries and religious differences through shared commitment to intellectual advancement. You witness the development of quality control systems as translation centres recognise that errors in converting complex philosophical texts can create lasting damage to European understanding of classical traditions. Master translators like Gerard of Cremona develop verification procedures where multiple scholars check each other's work, comparing translations against original sources to ensure accuracy in knowledge transmission. The social impact of recovered classical texts transforms European intellectual culture as scholars gain access to sophisticated logical systems, mathematical techniques, and scientific methodologies that had been completely unavailable in earlier medieval education. You observe how universities begin restructuring their curricula to incorporate newly available Aristotelian texts that provide more systematic approaches to natural philosophy than European scholars had previously possessed. You experience the religious tensions created when Islamic commentaries on classical texts challenge Christian interpretive frameworks that had developed in isolation from original sources. European theologians must grapple with Islamic philosophical achievements that demonstrate levels of logical sophistication that force uncomfortable questions about whether Christian scholarship had adequately understood its own classical foundations. The linguistic legacy of the translation movement permanently enriches European intellectual vocabularies as Arabic terms for mathematical, philosophical, and scientific concepts enter Latin and eventually vernacular languages. You observe how words like algebra, algorithm, and chemistry carry Arabic linguistic origins that preserve Islamic intellectual contributions, even as European scholars adapt these concepts for their own cultural purposes. You witness the emergence of hybrid intellectual traditions as European scholars attempt to integrate newly recovered classical texts with Islamic commentaries and contemporary Christian theological concerns. Thomas Aquinas spends decades creating synthetic frameworks that combine Aristotelian philosophy with Islamic logical techniques and Christian doctrinal requirements, producing intellectual systems that wouldn't have been possible without cross-cultural translation efforts. The technological knowledge recovered through translation projects provides European societies with practical capabilities they had lacked for centuries. You observe how Arabic treatises on hydraulic engineering enable European craftsmen to build more sophisticated irrigation systems, while translated medical texts introduce surgical techniques that dramatically improve European healthcare. You experience the competition between different European centres as universities and monasteries vie to acquire the most complete translated collections of classical texts. This scholarly competition accelerates translation efforts while also creating regional specializations as different institutions focus on particular types of knowledge. Medicine in Salerno, mathematics in Oxford, philosophy in Paris. The translation movement creates lasting intellectual infrastructure as European libraries develop permanent collections of recovered classical texts that provide resources for scholarly work that will continue for centuries. You observe how these institutional investments in translated knowledge create sustainable foundations for European intellectual development that will eventually produce the Renaissance recovery of classical culture. You witness the individual human stories behind massive scholarly enterprises as translators dedicate their entire careers to recovering particular classical authors or specialized fields of knowledge. Michael Scott spends 30 years converting Averroes' Aristotelian commentaries into Latin. becoming so immersed in Islamic philosophical traditions that his European colleagues sometimes question whether his translations reflect Christian or Muslim interpretive frameworks. The cross-cultural dialogue created by translation projects influences Islamic scholarship as Muslim philosophers engage with European intellectual traditions through the same channels that bring Arabic learning to European centres. You observe scholarly exchanges where Islamic and European thinkers collaborate on philosophical problems that neither tradition could solve independently, creating genuinely international intellectual communities. You experience the profound irony that European recovery of classical learning depends entirely on Islamic preservation efforts that maintained Greek wisdom during Europe's intellectual dark ages. The texts that will fuel Renaissance humanism and scientific revolution survive only because Islamic scholars valued and preserved knowledge that European Christianity had abandoned or destroyed. The translation movement establishes precedents for international scholarly cooperation that will influence intellectual development far beyond the medieval period. You observe how translation centres create working models for cross-cultural knowledge sharing that anticipate modern academic institutions and international research collaborations. You end this section in Toledo's Cathedral Library, watching European scholars studying newly translated Aristotelian texts alongside Islamic commentaries that reveal intellectual possibilities their own traditions had never explored. The Great Translation movement is systematically recovering Europe's forgotten classical heritage, while simultaneously introducing Islamic innovations that will transform European scholarship in ways medieval translators cannot imagine. Knowledge that had been separated by language, religion, and centuries of historical conflict flows together again, preparing the intellectual foundations for cultural transformations that will reshape human understanding of the world. You hear the excited voices of young students echoing through the stone halls of the newly established University of Bologna around 1150, where scholars from across Europe gather to study Roman law using complete legal codes that had been preserved in Byzantine libraries, while Western Europe struggled with fragmented, customary traditions. The emergence of these cathedral schools into genuine universities represents a revolutionary transformation in European intellectual life, the creation of permanent institutions dedicated entirely to advanced learning, where knowledge becomes a specialized profession rather than merely a byproduct of religious devotion or aristocratic leisure. The University of Bologna's focus on legal studies attracts students who recognize that recovered classical jurisprudence provides sophisticated tools for managing the complex commercial and political relationships emerging in Europe's growing cities. You observe young men travelling hundreds of miles to study with masters who can explain the logical principles underlying Roman legal codes, creating international scholarly communities that transcend the local loyalties and linguistic barriers that had isolated European learning for centuries. Do you remember the translation movement we witnessed, recovering classical learning from Islamic preservation? Now, those recovered texts provide the intellectual foundation for educational institutions that can offer systematic training in subjects that had been virtually unavailable in earlier medieval Europe. The University of Paris develops theology faculties that use newly translated Aristotelian logic to create sophisticated philosophical arguments, while Oxford masters teach mathematics using Arabic numerical systems that enable calculations impossible with Roman numerals. You witness the development of the scholastic method as university masters create systematic approaches to learning that combine classical logical techniques with contemporary intellectual challenges. At the University of Paris, you watch Peter Abelard demonstrate how Aristotelian dialectical methods can resolve apparent contradictions between different religious authorities, creating educational techniques that train students to engage in sophisticated rational analysis rather than simply memorizing traditional doctrines. The university system creates new forms of intellectual authority as masters develop professional qualifications based on demonstrated scholarly competence rather than religious rank, or aristocratic birth. You observe how academic degrees become certificates of intellectual achievement that enable social mobility for talented students, regardless of their family backgrounds, creating merit-based systems that challenge traditional European social hierarchies. Historians still argue whether medieval universities represented genuine educational innovation or simply formalized versions of earlier monastic and cathedral schools. But you witness clear evidence that these institutions create qualitatively different intellectual environments. Unlike monastery scriptoriums focused on preserving existing knowledge, universities emphasize critical analysis, logical debate, and systematic investigation of complex problems that require sustained collaborative research. You experience the intellectual excitement that permeates early university communities as students and masters engage with recently recovered classical texts that reveal the sophistication of ancient learning traditions. The availability of complete Aristotelian logical works enables university scholars to develop analytical methods that surpass anything achieved in earlier medieval education, creating scholarly techniques that will influence European intellectual development for centuries. The international character of university education creates knowledge networks that span political boundaries and cultural differences, establishing scholarly communities that operate according to intellectual rather than political loyalties. You travel with students who journey from England to Italy, from Germany to France, carrying letters of introduction from their masters and participating in scholarly exchanges that create genuinely European intellectual culture for the first time since the Roman Empire's collapse. You observe the development of specialized academic disciplines as universities create distinct faculties that focus on particular areas of knowledge: theology, law, medicine, and liberal arts, each with its own masters, curricula, and degree requirements. This intellectual division of labour enables much deeper investigation of complex subjects than had been possible when individual scholars attempted to master all available knowledge. The emergence of university libraries creates institutional resources that support serious scholarly research rather than simply preserving manuscripts for occasional consultation. You visit the library at the University of Oxford, where masters and students can access extensive collections of classical texts, Islamic commentaries, and contemporary scholarly works that provide the intellectual resources necessary for advanced investigation of philosophical and scientific problems. You witness the development of academic freedom as university communities assert their independence from local political and religious authorities who might interfere with scholarly investigation. The masters at the University of Paris obtain papal recognition for their right to control their own curriculum and degree requirements, establishing precedents for institutional autonomy that protect intellectual inquiry from external political pressure. The competitive relationships between different universities accelerate intellectual development as institutions vie to attract the most distinguished masters and promising students. You observe how Oxford and Paris compete to offer superior instruction in natural philosophy, while Bologna and Orléans develop rival approaches to legal education, creating scholarly competition that improves educational quality across multiple centres. You experience the social tensions created when university education challenges traditional sources of authority by producing scholars whose intellectual training enables them to question established doctrines and customary practices. University-trained lawyers develop legal arguments that challenge feudal customs, while university theologians create philosophical frameworks that require more sophisticated understanding of religious doctrine than traditional pastoral education provides. The economic relationships surrounding university education create new forms of scholarly patronage as wealthy individuals and institutions recognize the practical value of advanced learning. You observe how commercial cities fund legal education because trained lawyers can manage complex commercial relationships, While royal courts sponsor theological faculties because university-trained administrators can develop more sophisticated governmental policies, you witness the emergence of student culture as young scholars from different regions create social communities that blend serious, intellectual work with the typical concerns of young adults living away from family supervision. The combination of rigorous academic demands with relative social freedom produces distinctive university environments that nurture both scholarly achievement and personal development. The curricular innovations developed in early universities create educational methods that balance respect for classical authorities with encouragement of independent critical thinking. You attend lectures where masters present opposing views on complex problems and require students to develop their own reasoned conclusions, creating pedagogical techniques that train analytical capabilities rather than simply transferring existing knowledge. You observe how university education creates professional career paths that enable talented individuals to achieve social advancement through intellectual achievement rather than military service or commercial success. The church, royal administrations, and urban governments increasingly recruit university graduates for positions requiring sophisticated analytical capabilities, creating economic incentives for serious scholarly achievement. The international mobility of university-trained scholars creates knowledge transfer networks that spread intellectual innovations across European centres of learning. You follow a master trained at Bologna as he establishes legal education programs at newer universities, carrying pedagogical techniques and textual resources that help standardize educational quality across different institutions. You experience the intellectual confidence that emerges among European scholars as university education provides systematic training in logical analysis, textual interpretation, and systematic investigation that rivals anything achieved in Islamic or Byzantine learning centres. This growing intellectual sophistication prepares European scholarship for the more ambitious intellectual projects that will characterize later medieval and Renaissance learning. The development of university presses and scriptoriums creates more efficient methods for producing and distributing scholarly texts, making advanced learning materials more widely available than had been possible when manuscript production depended entirely on monastic copying efforts. You observe how university scriptoriums develop standardized text production techniques that reduce copying errors while increasing the speed of manuscript reproduction. You witness the emergence of scholarly networks that connect European universities with learning centres in other cultural traditions. As university masters establish correspondence with Islamic and Byzantine scholars who can provide access to texts and ideas unavailable in European libraries. These international scholarly relationships create knowledge exchange systems that transcend political and religious boundaries. The specialization of university education creates scholarly expertise in particular fields that enables much more sophisticated investigation of complex problems than had been possible when individual scholars attempted to master all available knowledge. You observe how university masters become genuine experts in specific disciplines, developing professional competence that surpasses earlier generalist approaches to learning. You experience the long-term cultural impact of university education as these institutions create permanent centres of learning that will continue developing European intellectual life for centuries, unlike monasteries that might decline due to religious or political changes. Universities establish institutional foundations that can adapt to changing cultural conditions while maintaining commitment to advanced learning. The democratic elements within university governance create participatory decision-making processes that involve both masters and students in determining educational policies and institutional priorities. You observe how university communities develop collaborative approaches to intellectual problems that anticipate later democratic principles in academic and political institutions. You end this section in a university lecture hall where a master presents logical arguments that synthesize classical learning with Islamic commentary and contemporary Christian theology, demonstrating intellectual capabilities that would have been impossible without the institutional resources and systematic educational methods that universities provide. European learning has finally recovered the organisational sophistication necessary to engage with the full complexity of human knowledge, creating educational foundations that will support intellectual achievements rivaling anything in human history. You stand in Johannes Gutenberg's workshop in Mainz around 1440, watching him carefully arrange individual metal letters into a frame that will revolutionize human knowledge forever. The mechanical precision required to align hundreds of tiny characters demonstrates the technical achievement behind this miraculous machine. But you understand that the true revolution lies not in the printing technology itself, but in its power to transform knowledge from a scarce luxury available only to elite scholars into a commodity that common people can afford to own and study. The first printed Bible emerging from Gutenberg's press represents the dawn of mass literacy and the democratization of learning that will shatter the intellectual monopolies that have controlled European education for centuries. The printing press arrives at precisely the moment when European intellectual recovery creates overwhelming demand for books that manuscript copying cannot possibly satisfy. You observe how the translation movement and emerging universities have generated enormous appetite for classical texts, scholarly commentaries, and educational materials. While monastic scriptoriums can produce only a few dozen copies of any work despite months of painstaking labour, a single printed edition can produce hundreds of identical copies in the time required to hand copy just one manuscript, creating economics that make learning affordable for the first time in European history. Do you remember the universities we witnessed creating permanent institutions dedicated to advanced learning? The printing press transforms these scholarly communities by providing reliable access to standardized texts that enable more sophisticated educational methods than had been possible when students depended on scarce, expensive, and often corrupted manuscripts. You attend lectures at the University of Paris, where every student owns identical printed copies of our Aristotelian works, allowing masters to reference specific passages with confidence that their entire audience can follow detailed textual analysis. You witness the cultural shock that accompanies the sudden availability of books, as European societies struggle to adapt to information abundance after centuries of information scarcity. A Venetian merchant named Paolo describes his amazement at owning more books than the monastery where he received his education, while a German craftsman explains how printed technical manuals enable him to learn metalworking techniques that had previously been available only through expensive apprenticeships with master artisans. The economic transformation of knowledge production creates entirely new social classes as printers. Publishers and booksellers develop commercial enterprises based on intellectual rather than agricultural or craft production. You observe how print shops become centres of urban intellectual life where scholars, students, and curious citizens gather to discuss new publications and exchange ideas, creating public spaces for learning that exist outside traditional institutional control. Historians still argue whether the printing press caused intellectual revolution or simply accelerated changes that were already transforming European learning. But you witness clear evidence that mass book production enables qualitatively different approaches to scholarship and education. The availability of multiple printed sources allows scholars to engage in comparative analysis that would have been impossible when consulting different texts, required travelling between distant libraries or waiting months for manuscript loans. You experience the liberation that ordinary people feel when printed books make learning accessible regardless of social class or geographical location. A farmer's daughter in rural Germany learns to read using a printed primer, while a merchant's son in Florence studies mathematics using printed treatises that introduce him to calculation methods beyond anything his local teachers could provide. Knowledge becomes a democratic resource rather than an aristocratic privilege, creating social mobility opportunities that threaten traditional hierarchical structures. The standardization of texts through printing eliminates the copying errors that had accumulated through centuries of manuscript reproduction, providing scholars with more accurate versions of classical works than had been available since antiquity. You compare printed editions of Aristotelian texts with manuscript versions and discover how printing has corrected countless scribal errors that had confused generations of medieval scholars, finally providing reliable access to authentic classical learning. You observe the emergence of vernacular publishing as printers recognize that books written in local languages can reach much larger audiences than scholarly works in Latin. The publication of technical manuals, legal codes, and religious texts in German, Italian, French, and English creates literate communities that can access practical knowledge without requiring classical education, breaking the linguistic barriers that had restricted learning to clerical elites. The printing revolution creates new forms of intellectual authority as authors can address reading audiences directly, rather than depending on institutional intermediaries who controlled manuscript distribution. You watch scholars developing personal reputations based on printed publications that circulate throughout Europe, creating intellectual celebrity systems that operate independently of traditional religious or academic hierarchies. You witness the development of commercial publishing industries as printers learn to identify market demand for particular types of books, creating economic incentives for producing educational materials, practical manuals, and entertainment literature that serve popular rather than scholarly audiences. The Aldine Press in Venice specializes in affordable editions of classical authors, while German printers focus on vernacular religious texts that appeal to growing Protestant populations. The speed of printing enables rapid distribution of new ideas across vast geographical distances, creating communication networks that can spread intellectual innovations throughout Europe within months rather than the decades required for manuscript circulation. You observe how printed pamphlets announcing scientific discoveries or philosophical arguments can influence scholarly debates across international boundaries with unprecedented speed. You experience the anxiety that traditional authorities feel as printing threatens their control over information and education. Religious institutions worry about heretical texts reaching popular audiences, while university masters fear that printed books might make formal education unnecessary if students can learn directly from published sources. These institutional concerns about democratic access to knowledge create censorship efforts that attempt to control what can be printed and distributed. The explosion of available texts creates information management challenges as scholars struggle to organize and evaluate the massive quantities of published material that printing makes available. You observe how libraries develop new cataloging systems designed to help readers locate specific information within collections that contain thousands rather than hundreds of books, creating organizational methods that anticipate modern information science. You witness the emergence of popular education as printed textbooks make it possible to establish schools in regions that had lacked access to expensive manuscript collections. Rural communities can afford printed primers and basic educational materials that enable local teachers to provide instruction without requiring extensive scholarly training, democratizing basic literacy throughout European populations. The commercial competition between different printing centers accelerates technological improvements as publishers develop better typefaces, higher quality papers, and more efficient production methods to attract customers in increasingly competitive book markets. You observe how Venice, Paris, and Antwerp compete to produce the most attractive and affordable editions of popular texts, driving innovations that improve both quality and accessibility. You experience the intellectual excitement that emerges when scholars gain access to vast libraries of printed books that enable comprehensive research projects impossible under manuscript conditions. A single researcher can now compare dozens of different sources on the same topic, creating opportunities for synthetic scholarship that combines multiple intellectual traditions in ways that individual manuscript readers could never achieve. The printing of maps, diagrams, and illustrations revolutionizes technical education by making visual information widely available for the first time. You observe how printed anatomy texts enable medical students to study detailed illustrations of human organs, while mathematical treatises include geometric diagrams that help readers understand complex spatial relationships that purely verbal descriptions could never convey adequately. You witness the emergence of scholarly journals and periodical publications that enable ongoing intellectual conversations between researchers who may never meet personally. Printed newsletters and academic publications create scholarly communities that transcend geographical boundaries, allowing intellectual collaboration on scales impossible during the manuscript era. The development of portable book formats makes learning mobile as printed volumes become light enough for students and scholars to carry extensive libraries during travel. You observe how university students can own personal collections that provide educational resources wherever they go, while merchants can carry technical manuals that enable them to learn new skills during business journeys. You experience the cultural transformation that occurs when reading becomes a private activity that individuals can pursue without institutional supervision or social oversight. Printed books enable solitary study that allows readers to explore ideas, question authorities, and develop independent conclusions without the social constraints that had characterized communal learning in monastic or university settings. The printing revolution creates feedback effects that accelerate intellectual development as increased book availability stimulates demand for literacy, which creates markets for more books, which generates resources for more printing, creating positive cycles that rapidly expand European learning capabilities beyond anything achieved during the manuscript era. You end this section watching a young apprentice operating Gutenberg's printing press, pulling fresh sheets covered with identical text that will soon travel to readers across Europe, carrying ideas that will spark intellectual revolutions he cannot imagine. The mechanical reproduction of knowledge has broken the scarcity barriers that limited learning for over a millennium, creating information abundance that will transform European civilization and prepare the intellectual foundations for modernity itself. You stand in the Medici Library in Florence around 1460, surrounded by Greek manuscripts that Cosimo de' Medici has purchased from Byzantine refugees fleeing the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. While humanist scholars like Marsilio Ficino work feverishly to translate Plato's complete dialogues into Latin for the first time in nearly 1,000 years, the Renaissance dawn you're witnessing isn't just an artistic flowering. It's the culmination of centuries of patient knowledge recovery, as European civilization finally regains access to its classical heritage and begins building upon ancient foundations with renewed confidence and creativity. The arrival of Greek scholars fleeing the fall of Byzantium brings Europe's intellectual recovery full circle. As the last guardians of unbroken classical tradition share their linguistic expertise and manuscript collections with Western scholars who've been painstakingly reconstructing ancient learning from Arabic translations and fragmentary Latin sources. You observe Gemistus Pletho, a Byzantine philosopher, teaching Florentine humanists to read Plato in the original Greek, revealing nuances of meaning that had been lost through centuries of translation and interpretation. Do you remember the printing press revolution we witnessed democratizing access to knowledge across European societies? Now, those mass-produced books carry recovered classical texts to reading audiences throughout Europe, creating unprecedented opportunities for scholars to engage directly with ancient wisdom, rather than depending on medieval intermediaries and interpretive frameworks. Lorenzo Valla uses printed editions to demonstrate that the donation of Constantine is a medieval forgery, applying classical linguistic analysis to expose centuries of historical deception. You witness the transformation of European self-perception as Renaissance scholars recognize that they have not only recovered classical learning, but actually surpassed ancient achievements in many fields. The synthesis of Greek philosophy, Islamic science, and medieval Christian theology creates intellectual capabilities that exceed anything available to ancient scholars who lacked access to such diverse sources. Pico della Mirandola's Oration on the Dignity of Man celebrates human potential for knowledge that transcends the limitations that constrained earlier civilizations. The humanist educational movement revolutionizes European learning by emphasizing direct engagement with classical sources rather than medieval commentaries, creating pedagogical methods that encourage independent critical thinking rather than deference to established authorities. You attend humanist schools where students learn to read Latin poetry, Greek philosophy, and Roman history in original sources, developing analytical capabilities that enable them to question traditional doctrines and explore new intellectual possibilities. Historians still argue whether the Renaissance represents genuine intellectual revolution or simply the culmination of medieval recovery efforts. But you witness clear evidence that European scholars have achieved qualitatively different relationships with classical learning. Rather than treating ancient texts as mysterious repositories of revealed truth, Renaissance humanists engage with classical authors as intellectual equals whose ideas can be criticized, improved, and applied to contemporary problems. You experience the excitement of rediscovery as European scholars encounter complete classical works that had been lost for centuries, revealing the full sophistication of ancient learning that medieval summaries and fragments had only hinted at. The recovery of Lucretius's On the Nature of Things introduces European readers to ancient atomic theory, while complete versions of Tacitus provide detailed historical analyses that surpass anything available in medieval chronicles. The patronage system emerging in Renaissance Italian cities creates unprecedented resources for scholarly research and artistic creation, as wealthy merchants and rulers compete to attract the most distinguished humanists and artists to their courts. You observe how the Medici, Sforza, and Este families fund translation projects, library construction, and educational institutions that provide material support for intellectual achievements that rival anything produced in the ancient world. You witness the development of new scholarly methodologies as Renaissance humanists apply classical analytical techniques to contemporary problems, creating hybrid intellectual approaches that combine ancient wisdom with medieval theological insights and empirical observation. Humanist historians like Leonardo Bruni develop critical approaches to source analysis that enable more accurate understanding of historical developments, while humanist political theorists like Machiavelli apply classical examples to contemporary political challenges. The artistic achievements of Renaissance culture demonstrate how recovered classical learning enables creative innovations that surpass ancient models rather than simply imitating them. You observe how artists like Leonardo da Vinci combine classical anatomical knowledge with empirical observation to create artistic representations of human form that exceed anything achieved by ancient sculptors or painters, while architects like Brunelleschi apply classical proportional theories to engineering problems that ancient builders never attempted. You experience the cultural confidence that emerges as European societies recognize that they have not only recovered from the Dark Ages, but achieved intellectual and artistic capabilities that surpass their classical models. This growing sense of cultural achievement creates psychological foundations for the scientific revolution and global exploration that will follow. As Europeans develop confidence in their ability to improve upon ancient knowledge through systematic investigation and creative application, the international character of Renaissance humanism creates scholarly networks that span European political boundaries. establishing intellectual communities that operate according to cosmopolitan rather than narrowly national loyalties. You observe how humanist scholars maintain correspondence that connects Florence with Paris, London with Rome, creating knowledge exchange systems that anticipate modern international academic cooperation. You witness the emergence of individual intellectual achievement as Renaissance culture celebrates scholarly and artistic genius in ways that had been impossible during the medieval period when learning was primarily collective and institutional. The concept of the Renaissance universal genius, like Leonardo da Vinci, represents new cultural values that encourage comprehensive learning and creative innovation, rather than specialized expertise within narrow fields. The printing revolution accelerates Renaissance intellectual achievements by making classical texts widely available while also enabling rapid circulation of new humanist works that build upon ancient foundations. You observe how printed editions of Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero provide common textual foundations for European intellectual discourse, while printed treatises by contemporary humanists spread new ideas throughout European scholarly communities within months of publication. You experience the religious and philosophical tensions created when Renaissance scholars apply classical critical methods to Christian texts and doctrines, challenging medieval theological syntheses that had seemed unquestionable for centuries. Humanist biblical scholars like Erasmus use classical linguistic techniques to demonstrate errors in medieval Latin translations of Greek and Hebrew religious sources, creating intellectual foundations for Protestant Reformation movements. The scientific developments emerging from Renaissance intellectual culture demonstrate how recovered classical learning provides tools for systematic investigation of natural phenomena that surpass anything achieved during the medieval period. You observe how scholars like Copernicus apply ancient mathematical techniques to astronomical observations, producing heliocentric theories that revolutionize human understanding of cosmic structure. While physicians like Vesalius use classical and anatomical knowledge combined with direct dissection to correct centuries of medical errors, you witness the emergence of vernacular literature that applies classical literary models to contemporary subjects, creating artistic achievements that make ancient cultural forms accessible to non-scholarly audiences. Writers like Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio demonstrate how classical literary techniques can express modern sensibilities, while playwrights like Shakespeare adapt ancient dramatic forms to explore contemporary psychological and political themes. The commercial and technological innovations of Renaissance culture demonstrate how classical learning provides intellectual tools that enable practical achievements beyond anything available to medieval societies. You observe how humanist education trains administrators, diplomats, and merchants who can manage complex commercial relationships, while classical mathematical knowledge enables engineering projects that surpass medieval architectural and hydraulic achievements. You experience the global perspective that emerges as Renaissance Europeans apply classical geographical knowledge to navigation and exploration projects that expand human understanding of world geography beyond anything known to ancient civilizations. The voyages of Columbus, Da Gama, and Magellan demonstrate how recovered classical learning provides intellectual foundations for achievements that surpass ancient models through creative application to new circumstances. The philosophical developments of Renaissance humanism create intellectual frameworks that anticipate modern democratic and scientific principles by emphasizing individual reason, empirical observation, and critical analysis rather than traditional authority and revealed truth. You observe how humanist political theory, natural philosophy, and educational methods prepare intellectual foundations for Enlightenment developments that will transform European civilization. You witness the cultural synthesis that characterizes Renaissance achievement as European scholars successfully integrate classical learning, medieval Christian theology, Islamic scientific advances, and contemporary empirical observation into comprehensive intellectual systems that exceed the capabilities of any earlier civilization. This synthetic approach demonstrates how knowledge recovery can become the foundation for genuine cultural advancement rather than simple restoration of past achievements. The institutional innovations of Renaissance culture create new forms of scholarly organisation that support intellectual achievement while maintaining the benefits of earlier medieval and classical models. You observe how Renaissance academies, libraries, and schools combine the systematic educational methods developed in medieval universities with the critical analytical approaches recovered from classical sources and the technological advantages provided by printing. You end this section watching the sun rise over Florence as Renaissance scholars begin another day of translating Greek texts, creating artistic masterpieces, and developing new approaches to understanding the natural world. The Dark Ages have ended not with sudden illumination, but through centuries of patient effort to recover, preserve, and build upon the intellectual heritage of human civilization. European learning has finally regained the comprehensive capabilities that characterize classical antiquity, but now enhanced by medieval theological insights, Islamic scientific advances, and technological innovations that enable achievements surpassing anything in human history. The Renaissance represents not just recovery, but transformation. As forgotten knowledge becomes the foundation for intellectual and cultural developments that will reshape human understanding of the world and humanity's place within it. As you drift away from Renaissance Florence, the urgency of intellectual discovery gradually softens into the gentle satisfaction of knowledge preserved and wisdom recovered. The frantic copying of medieval monks transforms into the quiet turning of printed pages, while the desperate searches through burning libraries become peaceful browsing in well-stocked personal collections. You feel the weight of centuries lifting as human learning finally finds stable foundations that can support whatever intellectual adventures the future might bring. The darkness that once threatened to swallow all human wisdom has given way to the warm glow of candlelit studies where curious minds can explore ancient thoughts and contemporary innovations with equal confidence. Knowledge flows freely again through societies that have learned to value learning not just as luxury for elites, but as essential nourishment for human flourishing. The printing presses continue their rhythmic work through quiet nights, multiplying wisdom and making it available to anyone with curiosity and determination to learn. The scholars and scribes, the translators and teachers, the monks and humanists who preserved human knowledge through its darkest period rest peacefully now, knowing their patient efforts have rebuilt the intellectual foundations that will support whatever heights human civilization might achieve. Their dedication ensures that future generations will never again face the terrible choice between survival and learning,